Good evening, it's Wednesday the 18th of May. Our top stories tonight. Finland and Sweden apply to join NATO as Ukraine pushes for a prisoner swap for Mariupol fighters being held by Russia. A British Tory MP arrested over allegations of rape and sexual assault dating back 2 decades. Police brutality under scrutiny in Fiji after the arrest of a bus driver. And Pentagon officials grilled over UFO sightings during a rare Congress hearing. You're watching The World. Hello, I'm Beverly O'Connor. Also tonight, Indonesia's palm oil farmers fighting to overturn their government's export ban. Well, first tonight, Finland and Sweden have officially applied to join the NATO military alliance. The Scandinavian countries say the move was driven by security concerns over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The application must now be considered by the 30 member countries. Both had sought to remain neutral, but public opinion in Finland and Sweden has shifted strongly in favour of membership since Russia invaded Ukraine back in February.
You are our closest partners, and your membership in NATO would increase our shared security. The applications you have made today are an historic step. Allies will now consider the next steps on their path to NATO. The security interests of all allies have to be taken into account. And we are determined to work through all issues and reach rapid conclusions. Over the past few days, we have seen numerous statements by allies committing to Finland and Sweden's security. NATO is already vigilant in the Baltic Sea region, and NATO and allies forces will continue to adapt as necessary. All allies agree on the importance of NATO enlargement. We all agree that we must stand together. And we all agree that this is an historic moment which we must seize.
Meantime, the fate of hundreds of Ukrainian fighters evacuated from a steel plant in Mariupol remains unclear after they surrendered to Russian forces. Several more buses carrying soldiers from the factory have been driven to Russian-controlled territory. The severely wounded are being treated in hospital, while others have been sent to a penal colony near Donetsk. The soldiers fought for almost 3 months in what became a symbol of Ukrainian resistance. More than 260 troops are now in Russian hands, with some yet to be evacuated. Ukraine says they'll be part of a prisoner swap, but one Russian politician has branded them war criminals and called for them to face trial. A British MP from Boris Johnson's Conservative Party has been released on bail after being arrested on suspicion of rape and other sexual offences. London's Metropolitan Police say they've received a report back in January 2020 alleging the Conservative lawmaker committed the offences between 2002 and 2009. A spokesperson for the Conservative Party confirmed the man, aged in his 50s, was a member of Parliament and has been told to stay away from Westminster while police are investigating. Police have yet to publicly name the suspect. Analysts are warning of more political turmoil for Lebanon after the weekend elections saw Hezbollah lose its parliamentary majority. It's feared a polarised parliament could lead to policy paralysis and undermine efforts to rebuild the crippled economy. Our Middle East correspondent Alison Horn.
Anger at the ruling class has been brewing in Lebanon since the economic collapse that plunged 3/4 of the population into poverty. But not even experienced political analysts could predict this outcome. People have taken to the streets across the country celebrating the change in power that they hope will improve the nation's prospects. Iran-backed militant group Hezbollah and its allies won less than half of the 128 seats up for grabs, effectively ending their 4-year reign of power. But who will lead is still a little unclear. No one group has claimed enough seats to secure outright leadership. But it's expected power will go to the right-wing Christian group Lebanese Forces, with the support of independent candidates. This result is seen as punishment for Hezbollah and its factions, who many feel have done virtually nothing to address the major economic meltdown 3 years ago that left most Lebanese without electricity, medicine and even food. But this result could still end in more turmoil for the people of Lebanon. It'll lead to a parliament that's highly polarised, with the two main blocs, Lebanese Forces and Hezbollah, staunchly opposed to each other. It'll mean passing any legislation to begin the country's financial recovery could be a challenge.
And we'll cross live to Lebanon to get more analysis shortly. Well, a Fijian police officer has been suspended over accusations he violently arrested a bus driver. A video of the incident has been shared widely, sparking debate about police brutality in the country. Marianne Farr with the story.
Fiji police are conducting an internal investigation after the incident at a bus stop in Labasa on Monday. A police officer was filmed yanking forcefully on the neck of 30-year-old driver Elvin Manny, who is later heard saying, "I can't breathe." The footage has been shared thousands of times on social media. This is a snippet of that video and a warning that some people may find this scene distressing. Mr. Manny was later charged with giving a false name and assaulting the policeman who arrested him. He was released on bail on Tuesday afternoon. The officer in question has also been suspended from duties pending an investigation into his conduct. Fijian MP Lenora Gerengeratabua witnessed the incident and tried to intervene, asking the police officer to stop. In the video, she's heard saying violence is not the way. The MP has described the event as shocking. There are now widespread calls to address police violence in Fiji, which the Fiji Law Society says is a systemic issue. It's understood the driver, Elvin Manny, will be filing charges against the police officer who arrested him.
The latest wage data is out and it confirms what many are feeling, that workers are going backwards. Wages are growing with an annual rise of 2.4%, but that is less than half the rate of inflation. The Labor leader is blaming the government for bad economic management, but the Prime Minister argues that soaring inflation is a global challenge. Here's political editor Andrew Probyn.
When sure-footed defence fails, when stamina runs down, break out the bulldozer and flatten all before you. All over the pitch and all at odds with a campaign built around easing pain.
Here we go.
His opponent proving hits can come without laying a finger.
The biggest cuts to real wages in more than 20 years.
We're seeing those wages start to rise again, but the challenge is inflation.
The latest wage figures showing pay packets increased by 0.7% in the March quarter and 2.4% over the year, less than half the 5.1% rise in the cost of living over the same period.
Australian workers are paying the price for a decade of bad policy and economic failures.
Scott Morrison pointing to the war in Europe to explain painfully high inflation.
It's one of the biggest shocks to the global economy, if not the biggest we've seen since the 1970s.
Economic management the focus for the final week of the election campaign. With Labor not releasing its costings until tomorrow, the coalition's decided to get in early.
Altogether, the Labor Party have racked up some $440 billion in additional spending pressures.
And exactly what did he count to conjure a figure so big?
Through nods and winks to the states and territories.
No one there to nod or wink in agreement.
The only way to change Australia for the better is to change the government this Saturday.
He does seem to be getting a bit ahead of himself, And, Australians will make this decision, Anthony. You don't get to make it before the election.
In a nod to budget repair, Anthony Albanese revealed a couple of savings today worth $750 million. But that's not the whole picture. Labor's costings will likely show higher deficits than the coalition alternative. The ALP will argue its spending will boost productivity, judging that when the nation already has $1 trillion IOU, tackling debt might not be the pressing issue it once was. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
Well, let's return to the Lebanon election, where Hezbollah has lost its parliamentary majority to Christian group Lebanese Forces. Joining me now is Joseph Kachechian, Senior Fellow at the King Faisal Centre for Research in Islamic Studies. Joe, great to talk with you again. What message was voters sending with Hezbollah now losing its majority?
Well, even though turnout was very limited or very low, less than 41% or so, I think that these elections have really changed the local scene more or less permanently. Unless there is a major crisis ahead, a major security crisis, this election proves that the Lebanese voters are no longer buying into the Hezbollah message that they are the ones who are defending this country. A majority of people, those who voted and those who abstained from voting, are essentially telling Hezbollah that their services are no longer required. It's a big slap on the face because of the fantastic loss from 71 to 74 in the 2018 elections, depending how you count, to today to 60 to 61 votes. That's a substantial loss. And of course, they've lost the majority because you need 65 votes in order to get anything done in parliament. Yeah. So it's a big step forward. It doesn't solve all the problems of Lebanon, but obviously you have to start with a first step, and this is it.
What, though, does it mean for the makeup of the parliament, and who do you think is likely to be able to form some form of coalition?
Well, here's the big question, of course. Now you have a divided country, parliamentary speaking. You have 60 to 61 votes to Hezbollah and its allies, and you have approximately 67 to 60 to 66 to 67 votes in the opposition. However, the opposition that is now victorious is not united. You have the Lebanese forces that have the largest parliamentary group, but you also have an estimated 45 newcomers into parliament. Most of these individuals are now representing a new venue, a new idea. Several of them are veterans of the October 17th, 2019 uprisings that shook this country upside down. 45 is not a small number, but nevertheless, these 45 are not speaking with one voice. They are not united to get the business of the country going. The only thing that unites all of these opposition forces is the fact that they oppose Hezbollah. But that's half of the message. Now that you have reached the position of authority, of power, if you would like, what you need to do, you need to have a program, you need to have a message, and you need to implement that program. Whether or not the opposition, now the majority, can get its act together and speak with one voice, or at least a legible and cohesive voice, remains to be determined. Chances are that they will on fundamental questions, but chances also are that the losers, namely Hezbollah and its allies, will try to put all kinds of roadblocks to make sure that none of the fundamental questions that need to be addressed, issues like capital control, issues like negotiations with the International Monetary Fund, issues that reforms in the banking sector, issues that have to do with the election of a new member of government, of a new prime minister, and within 6 months of a new president. All of these questions need to be resolved, and you need to have some kind of an agreement among this new majority in order to get things done. time will tell.
Yeah, indeed. The last time we spoke, you had lost power, the internet had no connectivity, people were living with fuel shortages and all sorts of daily issues. Has there been any improvement in the day-to-day situation?
Actually, the opposite is true. We're going from bad to worse. The fact that I'm able to speak to you without power cut is because I'm relying on batteries and solar power, essentially. There is no electricity being provided more than 4 hours per day right now. The situation has not improved in terms of the socioeconomic picture of Lebanon. However, having said all of this, the government must be giving credit, the outgoing government must be giving credit for managing to actually borrow some money from the international, from the World Bank and the international community to get these elections going. These were relatively peaceful elections, even though there was a lot of cheating, but that's very normal for Lebanon. Even the dead have participated in the voting. And again, that's very normal for a country like Lebanon. But nevertheless, the elections were held. They were relatively peaceful. There was a lot of corruption, money exchange hands, which was a good omen because a lot of people needed this extra money to get them going. But fundamentally, the socioeconomic situation has not changed. The pound is still losing its value today. The US dollar is exchanging at 31,000 Lebanese pounds, which is worse than it was last week. And shortages are galore. People are still queuing in front of petrol stations, and it goes on and on and on. I think that the challenge that the government now faces, the new majority faces, is that even though they are victorious and they have accomplished a small miracle, now the time has come to actually put their hands in the kitchen sink, so to speak, and start cooking a meal that could be at least palatable to a lot of people. They need to address fundamental questions, socioeconomic questions that the people of this country face. 80% of people are still living in poverty in Lebanon, and that cannot go on for a long time. Yeah. And the proof of this, what I'm saying, is in fact the low turnout. 41% of the population turned out. Where were the rest of these people? Of course, some had emigrated, but a lot of people were totally dejected by what was going on, and they did not want to participate because they assumed that nothing was going to change. Yeah. Well, we will see whether things will change, and they better.
Joe, I do hope that it does provide that circuit breaker, as you say, to make a difference. Great to get your analysis. Thanks so much.
My pleasure.
Well, North Korea has sent in the army to lead its response to a COVID outbreak as the virus sweeps through its unvaccinated population. But offers of outside help are still being ignored. Here's North Asia correspondent James Otten.
As fever cases sweep across the country, state television reveals a confident commander-in-chief leading the way. Presiding over a Politburo meeting, cigarette in hand, Kim Jong-un accused his officials of being inadequate and slammed their response to the first confirmed COVID-19 outbreak as immature. There's speculation this parade, marking 90 years of the country's military, was a super spreader event. Huge crowds, unmasked and not socially distanced. Soon after, the nation's non-existent vaccine program and severe lack of medical supplies were exposed.
We lacked awareness and understanding of the disease and did not know how to treat it.
It's impossible to pin down the extent of the outbreak in the secretive nation. North Korea has confirmed more than 1.7 million cases of fever, but it says the virus situation is taking a favourable turn. The armed forces have been mobilised, and according to state media, treatments ranging from painkillers to home remedies are working.
We were sick, but every night and morning I made us gargle with salt water.
It's what's not being shown that has experts worried.
You need antivirals. They don't have that. I'm certain of it. It's a matter of incredible urgency that we get the pills to them as soon as possible.
But offers of vaccines are being met with silence.
The regime is probably worried about the optics of it, the optics that the regime is not capable enough.
It's just terrible. You know, there's 26 million people who are already living under one of the harshest regimes in the world, and now they're facing this terrible health situation on top.
North Korea is desperately poor, with almost half the population undernourished. The United Nations has warned that locking down the country would have dire consequences for those already struggling to feed their families. James Oaten, ABC News.
The US President Joe Biden has condemned racism at a memorial service for 10 black victims of a mass shooting in the city of Buffalo. An 18-year-old gunman allegedly opened fire at a supermarket in a racially motivated attack. President Biden told the crowd that white supremacy is a poison in America.
Evil will not win, I promise you. Hate will not prevail, and white supremacy will not have the last word.
Meanwhile, primary elections are underway in the US for both major parties to select their candidates for the upcoming midterms. For the Republicans, the November vote will be an opportunity to wrestle back control of the Senate, which currently has the Democrats with a wafer-thin majority. But there's been a mixed result for candidates backed by the former President Donald Trump. Natasha Lindstedt is a professor of government at the University of Essex. Natasha, good to talk. What do these results tell us about the hold Trump still has on the Republican Party?
I think he still has a very strong hold on the Republican Party, and I know that he wants to run again in 2024. And we saw actually most of the candidates that he endorsed did win. Of course, there were some that didn't, but we see candidates like Mehmet Oz, who is still in the race neck and neck, but until he was endorsed by Trump, he wasn't doing particularly well. So he's able to bring attention to candidates that might not ordinarily get this type of attention. And I think he has such a stronghold on the Republican Party because they believe that he is able to inspire participants to come out, or voters, excuse me, to come out in droves, that their passion for him is so much stronger than the way people feel for other candidates, whether it be like Mike Pence, who could run in the election, or Ron DeSantis. So he seems to have this charismatic hold on people that other candidates don't have.
Well, it's a charismatic hold, but it also is a fear that if they don't seek his endorsement, that they will not get pre-selection. It was interesting, though, that the sort of scandal-plagued congressman who had been backed by Trump, Madison Cawthorn, was defeated. Do you think that had more to do with what his term played out like rather than Trump's backing?
Yeah, I didn't think it had much to do with Trump's backing in this instance. It was just that Cawthorn kept making mistake after mistake. He came to the airport with a loaded gun. He was driving without a license. He made comments that President Zelensky was a thug, and he accused congressmen and women of inviting him to drug-fueled orgies when that turned out to be false. So everything he kept doing, he was just basically digging his own hole. And I think the Republicans are probably relieved that he didn't win his primary.
Yeah. There were, I mean, you look at Dr. Mehmet Oz, you see the governor of Pennsylvania, Doug Mastriano. These are candidates that, would they have been credible candidates for the Republican Party 10 years ago?
No, I think that is really one of the negative side effects of Trump, of this celebrity type of candidate. But also, you're getting the quality of candidate is just deteriorating. They have no experience in politics, and they don't seem to be committed to the rule of law or democracy or democratic values or democratic institutions. We see with the case of Doug Mastriano. He's this far-right candidate that just didn't believe that the election results were valid. And he promises, if elected, that he's going to assign the Secretary of State to basically change the voter rolls, to make everybody re-register. And this is a way of really attacking underprivileged communities that find it very difficult to register to vote, and particularly minorities. And so we're seeing a shift that is really, really devastating for democracy with the rise of Trump and these Trump-like candidates.
Yeah. So when the Democrats say that November and then again 2024 is really the last chance to save American democracy, that doesn't sound like an understatement.
It's not an understatement. I mean, I thought that about 2020. It was incredibly pivotal election, and we saw that Trump did everything he could using violence to overturn it, tried to actually stage a coup, something that would have been considered unthinkable in American democracy before Trump. And so we've got another series of elections coming up that are also equally important. But the problem is the Democrats haven't been that great at selling what they've been doing, getting people out to vote. They haven't been performing very well with Hispanics and other communities that might normally vote for them. And so they're going to face a really uphill battle ahead. I can't imagine that the Democrats are going to be able to hold on to the House and the Senate in the 2022 midterms coming up.
Yeah. What was your reading of the request from the Justice Department for transcripts of interviews that had been conducted behind closed doors by the January 6th committee? Could that be a portent of legal problems for Donald Trump?
Well, you would think it would be. I mean, this investigation has been going on for over a year now to see whether or not federal law has been violated and other different types of crimes and misdemeanors. And there's been a real struggle to go after those that are the most responsible. You see that many people that are sort of in the lower level of involvement have faced some repercussions. But it would be important to see people higher up involved, particularly Donald Trump. He's been the mastermind behind this whole January 6th insurrection, and we've seen very little attack on him personally. We've seen all of his underlings and those associated with him face some kind of retribution, but not him personally. So there's hopes that this investigation is expanding and that they'll go after those that are at the top.
Yeah. Good to talk as always, Natasha. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Now to some breaking news, and a Russian soldier has been accused of shooting dead a civilian and has pleaded guilty in Ukraine's first war crimes trial since the invasion. 21-year-old Vadim Shishimarin admitted killing the unarmed 62-year-old in the days after the war began. He faces life in prison. Prosecutors say more trials could be forthcoming after identifying thousands of potential crimes committed by Russian forces. Moscow has denied its troops have targeted civilians. Well, for the first time in decades, US intelligence officials have faced Congress in a hearing focused on unidentified flying objects. The inquiry follows a report declassified last year showing video evidence of objects ducking and weaving at baffling speeds. The subcommittee shared concerns the objects could be advanced weapons systems of foreign adversaries, but the sightings remain largely unexplained. Here's Tyson Whelan.
Usually the product of Hollywood blockbusters and dark holes of the internet. Now, for the first time in more than 50 years before the US Congress, Pentagon officials faced tough questions from lawmakers about unexplained sightings of those flying saucers, for which there's bipartisan agreement around a supposed threat to national security.
For too long, the stigma associated with UAPs has gotten in the way of good intelligence analysis. Pilots avoided reporting or were laughed at when they did.
In 1970, after 22 years of investigations, the Air Force terminated its Project Blue Book.
We've been able to explain them as hoaxes, as erroneously identified friendly aircraft, as meteorological or electronic phenomena, or as light aberrations.
Yet, the more things have changed, the more they've stayed the same.
Any object that we encounter can likely be isolated, characterized, identified, and if necessary, mitigated.
A report released last year by intelligence officials counted 144 observations of objects flying at mysterious speeds or trajectories. One video released by officials shows a sphere appearing to pass an F-18 fighter jet.
In many cases, that's all that a report may include. And in many other cases, we have far less than this.
The sightings include 11 near misses with US aircraft, but Pentagon officials said no evidence of extraterrestrial life has been recovered from the brief interactions with the aerial phenomena.
And have we attempted to communicate with those objects?
No.
While a confirmed close encounter remains a plot seen only on the big screen, Tuesday's hearing is surely one step closer to removing the U from UFO. Tyson Whelan, ABC News.
Sorting fact from fiction. Well, South Korea's former presidential palace is opening its doors to the public for the first time in 75 years. Residents and tourists will now be able to explore the historical Blue House as the country's new leader relocates his offices to the Defence Ministry compound in the Yongsan district. The grounds have been set up like a fair with entertainment and food to entice locals and tourists. Yoon Suk-yeol will be the first leader to move his presidential office. Our top stories tonight on the world. A Russian soldier accused of shooting dead an unarmed civilian has pleaded guilty in Ukraine's first war crimes trial since the invasion began. A British Tory MP has been arrested over allegations of rape and sexual assault dating back decades. And police brutality is under scrutiny in Fiji after the violent arrest of a bus driver. Well, let's return to Finland and Sweden, officially applying to join the NATO military alliance. It's a decision spurred by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but has been met with objections from NATO member Turkey. Its president says Sweden should not expect Ankara to approve its NATO bid without returning terrorists. Recep Tayyip Erdogan believes both Sweden and Finland harbour people linked to groups Turkey deems terrorists accused of orchestrating a 2016 coup attempt.
We asked Sweden to return 30 terrorists. They said no. So you won't give us back terrorists, but you ask for NATO membership. NATO is an entity for security, an organisation for security. Therefore, we cannot say yes to this security organisation being deprived of security.
500,000 people have fled their homes in northern India to escape flooding triggered by pre-monsoonal downpours. Army personnel have already rescued more than 2,000 people in the Hojai district, but 8 people are confirmed dead. One of the largest river systems in the world, the Brahmaputra, burst its banks earlier this week, inundating 1,500 villages. Authorities are anticipating more rain to fall in the coming days, putting pressure on stretched water, food and water supplies. A man has pleaded guilty to killing 5 people and attempting to murder 11 others in a horrific attack in Norway last year. The perpetrator is said to have gone on a rampage, randomly attacking residents with a bow and arrow. The incident lasted for more than half an hour before the attacker was apprehended. Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese have been charting a course through marginal seats in this campaign, and where they go is telling about what exactly is in play. Here's data analyst Casey Briggs.
As we enter the final countdown of this race around the country, we've been watching closely where each of the campaigns are going. This shows you every media event held by either Scott Morrison or Anthony Albanese since the campaign began. It could well be a picture of where this race will be decided. And tallying up all of these points gives us this picture. Both leaders have spent more time in New South Wales and Queensland than any other state or territory. And for some of these, this reflects the size of the populations of these states and territories. But there are clearly 2 getting far more attention.
How good's that?
Tasmania has had several times the number of visits than its per capita population would suggest.
Hey mate, how you doing? Good.
The Northern Territory too. Scott Morrison has spent the most time here in seats he's hoping to win off Labor. Within Tasmania, all those visits are really being concentrated in the top half of the seat, and in particular, the northern Tasmanian seat of Bass. The poor people of Launceston must surely be sick of all the attention they're getting by about now. Despite all of its beauty and wonder in the world, South Australia is the least visited state through this election campaign. But when the leaders have gone there, they've always gone to Boothby. 7 visits there through the campaign across both leaders' camps. And Sydney is a key battleground in this election, another place the leaders keep returning to, none more than the Labor-held seat of Parramatta. Scott Morrison's been there 6 times, Anthony Albanese just the once. But the government clearly thinks it could well take that seat off of Labor come Saturday night, and it might need to if it wants to offset potential losses over here, where the Prime Minister has been notably absent.
No wonder you got a smile on your...
His presence here is viewed as unlikely to help moderate Liberals who are trying to defend their seats against Teal independents.
Hundreds of Indonesian farmers have protested against the country's ban on palm oil exports. The ban came into place late last month and was meant to address the rising costs and shortages of cooking oil. It's a hot issue for Indonesians, but smallholder farmers say the move has just slashed their salaries and done little to fix the problem. Well, let's get more on this story. We're joined by economist at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies in Jakarta, Fajar Hirawan. Good to talk, Fajar. Why did Indonesia firstly take the step of banning the export of palm oil?
Well, I think, like the main intentions of the policy is trying to maintain the domestic supply. And of course, I think at that time, the cooking oil price is going so significantly high. But I think, in my opinion, the policy is inappropriate because I believe that it might have a different impact, especially for the smallholder farmers. As you can see that there are so many strikes that, that really want to open the export of the CPO in the future.
Yeah. Because that was that flow-on effect for those people. But firstly, what was causing the shortage of cooking oil or the very high prices of cooking oil in the first place?
Of course, the first things that, make these cooking oil prices going up. Of course, the trend of the trend of the palm oil prices at the time is going significantly high. And then at that time, I think there's like an incentive for the businessmen, the producers of the palm oil in order to export instead of, fulfilling the domestic demand. So I think that's the main cause that why the cooking oil price in Indonesia is quite high at the time.
Yeah, and has banning the export of palm oil fixed the domestic problem in the short term?
Unfortunately, not really have a good impact. I can say that the price still quite high. And then I think, in terms of the welfare of the smallholder farmers now, I think it's getting a big issues. So that's why I think, the policy is inappropriate. And I hope that the Indonesian government should reevaluate this policy and hopefully, will open the export sooner in the future.
Yes, and Fajar, is there any sign that they will reverse this decision?
Well, the sign is, of course, based on the latest data, the export growth of Indonesia, it's a significantly dropped. I think from the fourth quarter of 2021, we can grow around 29% or more than 25%. But just now, in the first quarter of 2022, the export growth, I think, has significantly dropped to only 16% or less than 20%. And I believe that because the Indonesian government really want to, improve the performance of our trade, I believe that it will become one of the alert for the Indonesian policymaker in order to reevaluate the policy.
What impact is it having on the export markets, the countries that Indonesia was sending the palm oil to?
Well, because of Indonesia now, I think is a global player. I think the main exporter in the world, and I believe that we have a quite significant market share in the world. I think it's more than 60%, and followed by the Malaysian. I think this ban, of course, will impact the global supply chain, and I believe that at the end, the consumers, the global consumers, will get a high impact due to the increase of the products that mainly made by the palm oil. So I think, in terms of, disrupting the global value chain, I think is the main important impacts of this ban on CPO export.
Yeah, and is there a danger that countries like Malaysia could step in to fill the gap and then you could lose that market share?
Well, in that case, I can say that Malaysia now, I think, still, cover around 30% of the total export. And I believe that, Malaysia now, I think, enjoying themselves, to fulfill the demand, the global demand of the CPO or the palm oil. And I hope that it also become the second alert, that, we should, take again the coverage or the market share on the global market, especially on the CPO export.
Yeah, we'll watch and see what the government makes of it and decides to do. Fajar, thanks so much. Well, a suspect has been taken into custody after a fire broke out near the Griffiths Observatory in Los Angeles. People inside the building were forced to evacuate as the fire burned through 6 acres of the surrounding woodlands. The blaze was quickly contained and authorities say they are still investigating how it happened. Well, has there ever been life on Mars? That's what NASA is still trying to find out. Its Perseverance Mars rover has begun a journey on the red planet that may help to answer that very important question.
The parachute has deployed and... It's a mission that began with a jaw-dropping descent, beaming back real footage of a Mars landing. Over the last year, NASA's Perseverance rover has revealed the planet as never seen before, as it's trundled across the dusty terrain. And it's made history by flying the first helicopter on another planet. Now, though, Perseverance is starting the most important part of its mission, hunting for signs of life.
We know there was once liquid water on the surface of Mars. We know there are organics on the surface of Mars. And so all signs point to the surface of Mars 3.5 to 4 billion years ago being a habitable planet.
The rover's exploring an area called the Jezero crater. Billions of years ago, it was a huge lake. You can clearly see a river running into it. And this gives you an idea of what it once would have looked like. If we zoom in, this coloured area shows where the river met the lake, depositing sediment to create a delta. The rover landed here in the floor of the crater. It spent more than a year travelling the 7 miles, that's about 11 kilometres, to get to the base of the delta. Now it has a 40-metre climb to reach the top. So it's deployed the mini Mars helicopter to scout the best path ahead. Perseverance will drill into the most promising rocks, looking for signs of Martian microbes. The plan is for a future mission to bring these samples back to Earth.
Imagine if we found evidence that there was some sort of microscopic life there. That's huge. It's, mind-blowing in a way. And so I think the opportunity to look for that and bring it back to Earth and then see what we see is going to rewrite history books regardless of the answer.
This mission is revealing the eerie beauty of Mars, even showing us a Martian solar eclipse. The red planet is dry and dusty today, but now we may finally find out whether life ever existed on Mars.
Australia's wool producers are trying to cut the thousands of tonnes of carbon emissions that they generate every year. Now, one of the big contributors to that is transport. So as Aaron Cooper reports, some Tasmanian producers have hopped on board a rather novel way of taking wool to the market.
An unusual journey for precious cargo.
It's one of those things when it's suggested, you sort of think, OK, I'll go with that.
These bales of low methane merino wool have been pedalled hundreds of kilometres from Tasmania's northern Midlands to Hobart and will travel hundreds more to Geelong on board this sailboat. It's a one-off exercise by a fashion brand to see how close they can get to zero carbon wool.
It's an extreme example that makes us think. And through the thinking process, perhaps we can make little steps which will lead to big steps to improve things throughout the whole supply chain.
Australia provides a quarter of the world's wool. The industry is worth $3.4 billion. Consumers are demanding a more sustainable product. And part of that comes down to transportation.
It is the most significant contributor to emissions from a manufacturing point of view. But again, the important thing to note is that is a very small fraction of time in the life cycle of a woolen garment.
While carbon emissions are front of mind for many producers, it's not the only piece of the environmental puzzle. Some farmers are looking to other, less quantifiable factors.
It is absolutely critical in wool and across all industries that we have lower greenhouse gas emissions. While it is a really critical part of the story, it's not the only factor. So we also need to make sure that we're looking at other things such as biodiversity.
Colette Glazik and her family are planting thousands of shrubs on their sheep property annually.
We want to provide habitat for both insects, birds and other mammals.
From farm to arm with the smallest possible footprint. Erin Cooper, ABC News.
Record-breaking heat waves in India and Pakistan are seeing millions of people coping with daily temperatures above 45 degrees. Scientists say it should remind the world that the effects of climate change are being felt right now. Our South Asia correspondent, Evany Dice.
For decades, scientists have warned climate change would bring nightmarish heat waves. This gigantic landfill on the outskirts of Delhi is the size of 50 football fields. It's been burning for days during a record-breaking heat wave, a sign that the nightmare many predicted has arrived.
For decades now, I think the warning bells were already there, where we've been telling people that extremes are going to increase decade after decade, and of course the intensity frequencies are changing.
Indian summers are always hot, but the early and intense heat waves that struck in March and April are the worst since record keeping began. Parts of India have faced daily maximum temperatures of 47 degrees for the past 2 months. In the scorching heat, 4 fires ignited at landfills around Delhi, leaving the 50,000 residents who live around these rubbish piles to deal with the toxic stench of burning plastic and rotten food.
No one would live here if they didn't have to. We are living, earning and feeding our children. Why would we live here if we had other work? We would be living like other families.
Every morning, Geetha Devi gets ready for work at the landfill on her doorstep. Lately, things have been tough. She's copping the unbearable temperatures, smoke and the regular difficulties of her job.
It is not good to live here. There are so many problems.
Like 49% of Indians, Geetha works outdoors, selling iron from the landfill to make a little money. Geetha's in the vast majority of Indians who can't afford to cool down after working a full day in the heat. Hiding from the temperatures is not an option.
I don't like living in the heat, but we have no choice but to live here. During the fire, we weren't able to work. We were not allowed to go onto the landfill due to the fire, so we were left hungry. We are dependent on this landfill for our livelihood.
In these temperatures, which pass 40 degrees every day, the human body struggles to cool down. Hundreds of people have died in this heat wave, but there could be many more fatalities that haven't been recorded.
So definitely we are not prepared for that in terms of the health implications of it and to handle the health implications, because once you basically experience dehydration and a heat stroke, it entirely depends on how severe the condition is for the medical personnel to be able to deal with the situation and recover the person.
Scientists say there is no doubt this heat is linked to climate change. Studies have shown that severe heat waves in parts of India are twice as likely due to human activity. And they say things will just get worse if nothing's done about climate change.
By 2030s, if we are not on the path as a world where we basically, have a steep turn around, we are in for a disaster for many species on planet Earth, and including the human race.
In Delhi, the heatwave has caused riverbeds to dry out. In Pakistan, glaciers in the Himalayas are melting, causing flooding and a bridge to collapse.
There would be massive heat waves, there would be more floods, there would be more natural disasters and natural calamities in the future.
India is now facing a power crisis because of coal shortages caused by record electricity demand as people try to cool down. There's a push for the government to decarbonise, but climate activists like 13-year-old Arav Seth say it's taking too long.
I want the government to create policies and also implement policies for the environment, because right now most of the pollution is created by the industries, by the energy sector and by the fossil fuel companies. And I want the government to restrict those industries from doing these things, from polluting the environment.
India is among the most vulnerable to climate change, but Arav says no nation can afford to look away.
Right now here in my country, in India, we are facing massive heat waves that are only worsening the conditions of our environment, of the humanity here. So if we do not act now, Australia would be in the same condition.
What can I say? Many politicians come and go, but no one cares for us. No one cares how we are living. No one cares for poor people, they just care about the rich.
A painting by Pablo Picasso has sold for more than $67 million at auction at Sotheby's in New York. It comes a week after Andy Warhol's 1964 silkscreen portrait of Marilyn Monroe fetched $195 million, setting a record for a work by an American artist sold at auction. The 1932 Picasso painting is a portrayal of his lover, Marie Theresa Walter, as a sea creature. The painting is considered one of Picasso's most monumental pieces. And a treasure trove of entertainment memorabilia from famous movies is going up for auction in Hollywood next month. Leading the lots is a Star Wars X-Wing spacecraft model, which is expected to fetch more than $700,000. Other items include a hoverboard from Back to the Future, an animatronic gizmo from Gremlins 2, and Thor's hammer from the original Thor movie. More than 1,800 items are on offer, and auctioneers are hoping to raise up to $14 million. Australian swimmer Shayna Jack has capped her comeback from a drug ban by coming second in the women's 100-metre freestyle event at the Australian Swimming Championships in Adelaide. Her second spot guarantees her selection for the Australian team for the World Championships and Commonwealth Games later this year. It's the first time she's made an Australian team since she ended her 2-year ban for taking a prohibited drug. The race was won by Molly O'Callaghan, who set the fastest time in the world this year. And former Canterbury Bulldogs star Mick Potter has been appointed as interim coach after Trent Barrett's resignation. But captain Josh Jackson has criticised the club's handling of the situation, describing Barrett as the best coach he's ever had.
The Bulldogs were back at training for the first time since Trent Barrett's exit. Their captain says there was no need for a change and Barrett had the full support of the players.
Unfortunately, I'd like Trent to still be here, obviously. He's a fantastic coach and I hope he doesn't give it up.
Barrett wasn't helped by his record of only 5 wins from the past 34 games, but Jackson believes he shouldn't shoulder all the blame.
We're the ones on the field and we're the ones that aren't delivering the results. Unfortunately, Trent's fallen on his sword for us.
And that is it. Canterbury remains on the bottom of the ladder despite some high-profile off-season recruits.
I thought with the new signings we'd see some improvement in attack, and you look at the performance last Friday against Newcastle and it was really uninspiring.
For now, former West Tigers coach Mick Potter is taking charge.
He's won 2 premierships here and he's got a lot of experience as a head coach.
While Mick Potter will fill Barrett's shoes in the interim, the Bulldogs are in no rush to appoint a full-time replacement. The players, though, want a decision to be made soon to give them some clarity over the club's direction. The Bulldogs will be hoping to end their turbulent week with a win against the Tigers on Friday. Chloe Hart, ABC News.
Let's get a check of the weather. Here's Paul Higgins.
Well, tomorrow the rain that's been falling over Western Australia into South Australia will weaken out, and gusty winds and showers in the southeast will also ease as the high moves further east and ridges in. But that high is going to increase onshore winds over the Queensland coast, and together with an approaching upper level trough, it'll cause some showers to ramp up there, especially Friday and Saturday. Thursday in Perth and in Brisbane there'll be a shower or two, and in Melbourne just a chance of a shower on a partly cloudy day. Sydney will have blue skies. In Canberra, a frosty -1 degree start to your day. In Hobart, a possible shower. Adelaide will be mostly sunny, and sunny in Darwin.
Our top stories tonight: a Russian soldier on trial for war crimes in Ukraine has pleaded guilty to killing an unarmed civilian. A British Conservative MP has been arrested over allegations of rape and sexual assault. Police have yet to name him. And Fiji's police are investigating the violent arrest of a bus driver, which has sparked outrage among many citizens. And that is your world for this Wednesday. You can watch the show on iView, and there are more world news and interviews at the ABC's YouTube channel. I'm Bev O'Connor. Bye for now.
It's the daily destination for everything election.
It's about Australians and the decisions they're making.
We go beyond the campaign trail.
Good to be out and about.
And speak with all the key players.
You don't believe your own government's commitment.
If it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck.
Plus, expert analysis on the seats that could decide the result.
For the latest in your electorate and around the country.
Greg, plenty to
talk about.
Join Greg Jennett and Fran Kelly for afternoon briefing. Weekdays at 4 on ABC News and ABC iView.
The lost children of Saudi.
Le había dicho a mi mamá que iba a regresar y nunca regresó, entonces.
Every child is entitled to a mother and a father.
And the fathers who abandoned them.
I had that overwhelming urge and drive to find him.
Searching for answers.
He said when he saw me that I look exactly like him. I understand a lot more in detail the culture of his family and the sheer terror that my father must have felt.
Foreign Correspondent, tomorrow at 8 on ABC and ABC iView.
Every Thursday on Q&A, your questions get the nation talking.
Why is politics still a race to the bottom?
Young people are disappointed, disenchanted. That does not mean that young people do not care about politics.
I think it is both parties, and I actually think that independents are a symptom rather than a solution in themselves.
It's the countdown to Election Day. David Spears is joined by Kathy McGowan and Peter Harcher with live music from Paul Kelly. Q&A tomorrow on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Saturday, Australia decides.
Together we can build a better future.
Strong economy means a stronger future.
Who will be our next PM?
Because we're backing you.
Australians deserve better.
Join Australia's best political minds as we bring you live results seat by seat.
Lost 1 or 2 seats to independents.
Can the coalition go a 4th term? Or will Labor rise to power? Australia votes. Saturday from 6 on ABC or live stream on ABC iView.
You are playing the version of yourself you imagined you are seen as from the outside.
I think what's scarier is just not being seen at all.
It's really magical. Everyone is just coming to life.
Space 22, Tuesday at 8 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
At election time, we all come together to help choose a direction for Australia's future. So it's important that you understand how to make your vote count. For the federal election, you need to complete 2 ballot papers, a green one for the House of Representatives and a large white one for the Senate. On the green ballot paper, put a 1 in the box beside the candidate who is your first choice, then a 2 in the box beside your second choice, and so on until you've numbered every box. On the white Senate ballot paper, Put a 1 in the box above the line for the party or group that is your first choice, then a 2 in the box for your second choice, and so on until you've numbered at least 6 boxes. Or you can choose to vote below the line by numbering at least 12 boxes for individual candidates in the order of your choice. Make sure you know how to vote correctly, because your vote will help shape Australia. To learn more, visit aec.gov.au or call 132326. Authorised by the Electoral Commissioner, Canberra.
Will you marry me? All we need is a JP. Then you got yourself a bank loan.
Snap marrying Danny, but also he can get the drop on Lightwave.
You're rustling my balls, George.
Barron's, Sunday 8:30 on ABC TV or stream the series on ABC iView.
In a softer and softer world, there is only one truly hard test left. Those who survive have their names forever forged in brass. So, how can we truly know an expert from an imposter?
We test them on Hard Quiz.
Hard Quiz returns next Wednesday at 8.
Hello, Von Yong with the top stories on ABC News. Just 3 days out from the election, the cost of living has again dominated campaigning. Data shows wages are growing with an annual rise of 2.4%, but that's less than half the rate of inflation. Labor leader Anthony Albanese is blaming the government for bad economic management, but the Prime Minister argues soaring inflation is a global challenge. New South Wales has announced a new public inquiry into the conviction of Kathleen Folbig over the deaths of her 4 children. Folbig remains behind bars over the murder of 3 children and the manslaughter of a 4th. Various court appeals since then have failed, and an inquiry in 2019 reinforced her guilt. But another inquiry is needed to examine new scientific evidence suggesting a genetic mutation could be responsible for the deaths of 2 of the children. And the fate of hundreds of Ukrainian fighters evacuated from a steel plant in Mariupol remains unclear after surrendering to Russian forces. Several more buses carrying soldiers from the factory have been driven to Russian-controlled territory. The wounded are being treated in hospital while others have been sent to a penal colony near Donetsk. Those are the latest stories. I'm Yvonne Yong.
Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, the latest wage increase fails to keep pace with surging inflation, putting the rising cost of living centre stage ahead of polling day. New scientific evidence sparks a fresh inquiry into Kathleen Folbig's conviction for killing her 4 children. And we look at the growing demand to cut the chit-chat when it comes to getting a haircut. We can make no such promises here. Joining me on the panel, editor at The Guardian Australia, Lenore Taylor. Thank you so much for coming in. Are you nearly out of chat?
Almost.
In Newcastle, CEO of the Australian Hairdressing Council and Managing Director of Suki Hairdressing, Sandy Chong. Wonderful to see you again.
Hi, thanks for having me.
2 former premiers in Melbourne, former Labor Premier, Victorian Labor Premier, Steve Bracks is with us. G'day, Steve.
G'day, good to be with you.
And in Perth, where it's raining, former West Australian Liberal Premier, Colin Barnett. Lovely to see you as always, Colin.
Yeah, nice to be on the show.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we're on Facebook. With the election just 3 days away, there's certainly a narrative firming up about who's likely to win and how big that margin could be. That narrative, of course, relies on the much maligned science of opinion polling. According to the latest Guardian Essential poll, the margin of Labor's lead on a 2-party preferred basis has narrowed. It's now sitting at 48% to the Coalition's 46%, shifting 1% apiece since a fortnight ago. But of course, all that falls within the poll's margin of error of 3%. Today, Anthony Albanese made his final major election pitch in front of the National Press Club after warning Labor would inherit the worst set of books of any government elected since Federation. Mr Albanese was pushed on whether some of his signature policies would make Australia's debt level even worse.
You've spoken about
the vision that you have for the next term of Parliament under a Labor government, and a lot of that is about building things in Australia and about local jobs. The key policy mechanism is the National Reconstruction Fund, which you want to build up with $15 billion. What can you tell Australians about the safeguards over that $15 billion? Will we see independent oversight of that money?
Will be completely transparent. And what we're doing, what we'll establish is essentially the model that has worked really effectively with the Clean Energy Finance Corporation model. So arm's length. Arm's length. They won't be political decisions. They'll be decisions based upon a proper analysis.
The Labor leader was also asked why the costings for his party's policies have still not been released.
We have been transparent the whole way along. We are releasing our costings tomorrow. I had some detail today, which I flagged yesterday in one of the 18 questions I took at a media conference yesterday. I flagged that I would have more to say today about our costings, because I respect the National Press Club and always have a couple of announcements here. And today's return to budget of $750 million is a costing announcement that we scheduled to make today.
Let's start with you, Colin. I'm interested in this focus in the media, certainly, on costings and between the political parties. I wonder how relevant that is to Australians. I mean, costings never seem to last a season. If they're announced in winter, they never make it to spring and so forth. Wages are always wrong. The price of minerals is always wrong. They're always wrong.
Well, I think it is incumbent on parties to, along with an announcement, say what it's going to cost. I think in defence of oppositions, they probably need more support from Treasury in getting good costings done of their policy announcements. Obviously, an incumbent government's got enormous advantage in that. They can prepare policies and costings well in advance of an election. So I think transparency is important, and Treasury should be able to give a costing throughout the election campaign if that party wants that to happen.
But the debate is about whether or not Labor has left that too late. Do you think anyone's listening to that sort of debate anymore?
Well, it's not quite too late. At least it's a couple of days before the election. But I don't think people get too fascinated by costings. It's more an opportunity for the media, if I can say so, to catch someone out. But I think Anthony Albanese's done a reasonable job in trying to put out his costings. Some of them will be wrong, and let's face it, some of the government's costings and projections will be wrong too. Uncertain world. OK, is it pretty clear, though, Steve Bracks, that if Labor intends to spend more, then it will run a bigger deficit? Now, the question again with that is, does that have any impact when there's this amount of red ink already?
I don't think it'll have any impact at all, actually. I think the reality is that most of the budget deficit is driven by the expenditure which was required in the last 3 years of the pandemic, and the commitments during this campaign pale into are very insignificant compared to that. They're just a blip, really. And I think also...
Nobody would have said that 3 years ago. Oh, 10 billion here, no, 15 billion there. It's just a blip, really?
Yeah, they wouldn't have said that 3 years ago. But such is the extent of the spending and the deficit as a result during the pandemic that it is a blip. And the reality is that I think by committing to infrastructure in the majority of spending for Labor, that is a productivity-gaining expenditure. And it will actually reduce the outlays. Expenditure on good infrastructure means you've got less ongoing maintenance costs and less recurrent costs. And so long term, it'll be better for the economy, really. And I think Labor will be easily able to explain that away. This costing stuff is a real insider's view. I don't think the public care one iota, really. And every election that I've fought, oppositions have released their costings on a couple of days before the election. There's nothing unusual about this. It's happened every time.
Lenore, do you want to keep talking about costings?
No, I mean, I do have a couple of thoughts about costings. Of course, it's important that policies are costed, and thankfully we've got the Parliamentary Budget Office now that does that for the parties. I have two questions about this whole debate, shenanigans about costings. One is, we never really focus either on the quality of the spending, as Steve was talking about, or or the quality of the savings that the parties sort of pull out of their ear at the last minute to try to make their position look incrementally better. And the saving that the coalition announced the other day to try and sort of improve their budget bottom line was the efficiency dividend cut to the public service. Is that really going to be a net saving at the end of the day once they've contracted in all the consultants to do the work that the public servants used to do? I don't know. And the other thing, as Steve was saying, is we're not talking about the elephant in the room, the structural condition of the budget. We're talking about who can make the, a tiny incremental difference in terms of what's happened over the course of the campaign. So I do think it's a bit of a sideshow debate at the end of the campaign in the way that it's done, even though having costings is important.
What do you think, Sandy, when Lenore talks about a structural deficit? I mean, do you know what that means? Do people know what that means?
No, I don't think that they would really know what that means.
I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot because I Googled it earlier, but do you know what that means?
No. No, I wouldn't know what that means.
We'll just hang 1 second, Lenore will tell us.
So, I mean, if it was your household budget and you had a debt, you would want to be seeing that a deficit, your outgoings were more than your incomings. You would want to see that you were improving that over time, so you would get back to even Stevens.
You're spending more than you earn.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to see that it was kind of sitting there out into the never.
And the structural element of it is it looks like that
it's
ad
sitting there
infinitum.
Well, I mean, both parties say growth when you ask them that. And that is part of the answer. Yes, if you grow the economy quicker, then the budget will improve. But as you said at the outset, all of these, the growth estimates are about as reliable as all the other estimates. And so really the spending built into the budget is such that it's going to be hard for whomever wins on Saturday to bring those deficits down in any quick pace.
So, Sandy, then coming back to then when Anthony Albanese stands up, right, and says something like, we're going to shave down these grants programs that a lot of reporting has suggested I think it's unarguable, has gone much more to marginal coalition seats than safe coalition seats or Labor seats, right? We're going to stop that, so you can forget about your swimming pools in marginal coalition seats. Does that have an impact? Does that sort of register, do you think?
I don't think that. No, I don't think that really has an impact when I think about small business. So from where I come from, when it comes to the election, everything that I need to hear is how is that going to affect me as a business person? How is that going to affect me as, because I'm a mum and I have a daughter with a young family. And so I find that a lot of this campaigning is incredibly frustrating because really we just want to see the big picture. Really can't stand all the bickering that happens, and I especially can't stand any of the character assassination that goes on as well. From a small business perspective, I just really need to know, what's in it for me from a big picture, and also, I guess, the details. They make a difference.
One thing I think we should note that does matter is that the Prime Minister said this week that he doesn't actually think that pork barrelling spending matters at all, that he thinks governments should be able to spend how they want and that it is actually not a problem, despite all the Audit Office problems over many governments going back that says that it is a problem. I thought that was quite astounding this week, that he's actually saying, we should be able to spend in marginal seats exactly how we like.
Colin, can I come to you on that question that we heard Albanese address before? And this was around his National Reconstruction Fund, right, Colin? So this is $15 billion and it's divided up at $3 billion for green metals and clean energy. Then there's $1.5 billion for medical manufacturing. I thought of you on this one, $1 billion on value adding for resources funds, right? The idea you don't just dig it up and shovel it out the door, you might actually process it in Australia. $1 billion on critical technologies, $1 billion on advanced manufacturing, and then $1 billion to the ag sector to help diversify and open up new possibilities for trade. Now, does that, given the inflation that we've got in this country, and the UK just announced as we were coming to end, 9% inflation, does that sort of spending that I've just outlined, does that worry you?
Well, I think we need to be very careful the way government money is spent, and it's appropriate to support research and development. It's appropriate, as Steve was saying, to develop and invest in infrastructure that is available for anyone to use. But look, I don't support giving money to mining companies and the like, which is happening in Australia now. I can honestly say in 20 years around the mining industry, I've never given away $1. And yet we've had Western Australia, probably the world's biggest mining economy. So a lot of money has been spent on things that I don't think the taxpayer should be funding.
Steve, you're laughing along. You look like you agree.
Oh, I think there should be an inquiry into the amount of money that's got into carbon sequestration funding. Even when I was in government, I can remember partnering with the Howard government on billions of dollars that we spent. There's been billions and billions since, and nothing has come of it. No carbon has been sunk. No project has been viable. It's been a total waste of money, and I'm with Colin on this. I think it has been an excuse for the mining industry to try and keep doing what they're doing, and particularly for the fossil fuel industry to keep doing what they're doing. And this is their explanation. Please invest in this because we'll have clean coal generation, for goodness sake. I mean, the reality is that I actually support the policy that Anthony Albanese is putting forward on advanced manufacturing and the investment in that for the future. Medical technology, I think, is an area that we can do very well on in Australia. And I think if you like, there is a distinction between the parties on this policy, and it's one that I think is close to the heart of Anthony Albanese. He's been on this for a while, and I think it's a good one for the future.
Okay, well, let me just finally on this ask you, Lenore. I mean, inflation is just too much money chasing too few goods. So does there come a point where a lot of this spending, not so much on this, but on big infrastructure projects that you see right around this country, that might need to be dialed down because the same building sector is chasing, in the private sector, is chasing workers and chasing materials, and that's inflationary.
And it's chasing flood reconstruction,
right,
and it's chasing fire reconstruction. And yes, I think I think the pressure on the construction industry and the building industry is actually a real issue.
And for anyone who wins might have to reconsider all of that.
Yeah.
And you think that would be a live question after the election?
I think it's a live question because I think the sort of inflationary impact of having that much demand in that sector is something that needs to be looked at.
Well, The Guardian Australia has released analysis that suggests that some of the issues voters care about, hang on to your hats here, are being overlooked by the media. They compared an ANU survey where respondents ranked their top policy areas of concern with questions put to both leaders at press conferences. What a dastardly thing to do. Following cost of living, aged care was ranked the second most important issue in this election by survey participants, but it ranked 12th in terms of the number of questions asked by journalists. Education was also up there as the 5th most important issue to voters, but it's only the 13th most asked issue in press conferences. Sandy Chong, give vent to your frustration. Take all the time you need.
Well, I think that during the pandemic, when we look at aged care, for instance, I mean, it was an area that was really neglected. And so I really think that it should be very much up there when it comes to this election as in something of interest. I think that, that we do have a social and community responsibility. And it's very disappointing, I guess, that it's really not up there when it comes to the media asking questions about, well, what is happening in our very near future in taking care of our aged care community, but also education. I mean, you look at how education has really changed in the last couple of years because of the pandemic. And yeah, I don't know why those two really important, I guess, I don't understand why those two things are not being brought up by the media within this, within this campaign. I mean,
the other one, of course, that you nominated when we spoke to you earlier was climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, climate change, I think, when we think of young people, it's the number one on their list as well. And they're voters today. It's really important that we listen to them. So, when it comes to climate change, social responsibility, definitely the aged care and education, they're probably the top 4 things on a young person's mind. Of course, worried about inflation, etc. But when we think about those other things, it's like, where are they and why aren't they being talked about a little bit more? As I said before, from where I come from, just listening to, the campaigns and listening to the debates, there's just so much, there's a lot of pettiness at the moment. It's really quite frustrating listening to the media. I really want to probably get more down to the facts as to what are they actually really going to do in the big picture and the small picture, the details. And I think that's really missing, in those areas as well, as you said.
Colin, I saw a tweet earlier today that said that NITV which is Indigenous TV, a program called The Point, airing an election special, have been trying for weeks to get someone from the coalition to discuss First Nations issues. Questions put by a studio audience, and the coalition HQ said no one is available. Now, I don't know whether that's changed since that tweet was made, but to what extent is this because politicians, Labor, Liberal or politicians, don't want to have certain conversations?
Well, maybe a little bit, but I think one of the things that I've noticed in this campaign is there's been very little vision, no big thinking at all. Toward the end, at least, there was a debate about housing, and of course for Indigenous people, housing is probably the most critical issue. There's been a little bit about dental care, perhaps becoming part of Medicare. I think the Greens came up with that.
So I was stunned to hear that you're a fan of this Greens policy, Colin Barnett, former Liberal Premier.
Well, I just think it's got merit as a topic to be looked at carefully. And what we're seeing, I think, in this election is a huge amount of confusion. Federal members, federal candidates are running around making all sorts of commitments at a very local level, almost local government stuff, not addressing the issues that I think people expect to see to come out of a national government. And I think dental care's one because of Medicare. As I said, housing finally emerged as an important issue. The rest of it was about building playgrounds and giving grants to sporting clubs and the like. That's not the role of our national government. And I think that's been the saddest, most disappointing aspect of this election campaign.
Lenore, I saw somebody saying something similar to what Colin's just said. You'd think the two protagonists were running for Mayor of Australia.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Just to be clear, the exercise by my data team also looked at press releases and media releases, not just questions at press.
And did that show any differences in terms of what the parties are trying to get out?
Look, not much. The rankings of the issues showed that there was a big discrepancy between what people wanted to talk about and what was being talked about. I mean, I think there's reasons for that. There's some topics that the parties don't want to talk about. I think the coalition thought that climate change would be neutralised in this election because they had the same 2050 target. And that means that they don't want to talk about the inadequacy of the policies they've got to get there. I think it's also a function of where the media gets to ask questions, because you can get much better, more thoughtful questions in, for example, at the National Press Club than you can in a shouty, quick doorstop on the campaign trail. So it depends where the debates happen and where the questions are asked. But I do think it should give the media pause for thought as well, that there's a discrepancy that big.
What does that mean for the parties, do you think, Steve, any political party or indeed any independent, in terms of how to have that conversation with people? Because I remember on the Sky debate, I think, there were questions of the leaders asked from ordinary people.
And they were good questions.
Yeah, as Sandy said, they were kind of housing and education and disability.
NDIS, yeah.
They were the questions.
Yeah, well, I certainly know that the Labor campaign would love to be talking about health and aged care and climate change, but we just haven't had the opportunities. I think there was a bit of a start on aged care where Anthony Albanese was pushing that pretty hard. But, this campaign, it's been a pretty average campaign, but it's been dominated by opportunistic issues. So when there was an issue in the Solomon Islands with the government allowing defence facilities or defence activity from China, that became the dominant issue. When the RBA put up their cash rate, that became the dominant issue. Today, the ABS figures on unemployment, wage rises has been the issue. So it's been very opportunistic, and I think it's very hard to shake the media pack from those opportunistic issues. They hunt as a pack, and they really focus on that issue of the day.
They've been trying really hard.
Their time horizon's roughly about 24 hours, it seems to me.
All right.
I think the best debates have been the portfolio debates of the National Press Club on foreign affairs, on, there was to be one on health, but I don't think the health minister, the future one, turned up. But the ones, they've been much better, and they've been more, they've brought up better issues, I think, and I think more of that coming would be better.
Okay, just really quickly, Lenore, is there any evidence that Labor has wanted to have a big conversation about climate change during this election?
Look, I don't think they really want to have a huge conversation about climate change because their policy is not really adequate either. It's just a bit better than the coalition's.
After 2 decades after her conviction, an inquiry will consider whether Kathleen Folbig really did kill her children. In 2003, Kathleen Folbig was found guilty of murdering 3 of her children and the manslaughter of a 4th. It was considered unfathomable that all 4 could die via natural causes, but she always denied killing them. Now, scientific evidence shows that 2 of her children had genetic mutations that can cause sudden death. A petition for a pardon, supported by high-profile Australian scientists, was given to the New South Wales Governor last year. And while the State Attorney-General says the evidence is compelling, he announced today that a new inquiry would be necessary.
I can well understand why members of the public may shake their heads and roll their eyes in disbelief about the number of chances that Ms Folbig has had to clear her name, and why does the justice system allow someone who's been convicted of homicides, multiple homicides, yet another go. But the evidence clearly, in my view, reaches the necessary threshold for some kind of intervention.
Kathleen Folbig's solicitor only found out the news a minute before that press conference. She told the Drum they are hoping science wins out.
I'm advised that her very close friend has advised her of the outcome, which is I would have liked to have told her myself. I have been advised by her friend that she's bitterly disappointed, but she knows that we are here to stand with her to ensure the truth and the evidence is properly understood by the legal system. So we look forward to putting forward our overwhelming evidence to this new inquiry.
For more on this, we're joined by ABC journalist Rachel Brown, who has reported extensively on this case. Rachel, thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Ellen.
Tell us about this new scientific evidence and who are the scientists who are urging the Attorney-General to take it seriously?
The new evidence revolves around a gene mutation that scientists say Kathleen Folbig passed on to her 2 daughters. It's the CALM2 gene, and a mutation, that gene regulates protein to the heart. And scientists say that a mutation in that they've found causes 99% lethality. So they think there's almost no doubt that this gene mutation caused the death of Laura and Sarah. Now, about 160 scientists lent their name to a petition in March last year saying that Kathleen Folbig should be pardoned. Now, that in itself, as you'd probably be aware, is remarkable because scientists usually never agree on anything. Science is such a grey area. So for this many scientists to agree is remarkable, but also for them to step out of their field and sign a petition. This petition included 3 Nobel laureates to say, we think, Attorney General Mark Speakman, we think you should pardon Kathleen Folbig, was remarkable. Now, that happened in March last year, that petition, after this scientific breakthrough was published in the respectable science journal Europace. And Mark Speakman has been considering what to do with that evidence over the past 14 months.
OK, and the conviction was reviewed back in 2019. Was this evidence, this scientific evidence, around at that stage?
It was, Alan, but it was scientists gave evidence that it could be lethal, but no research, no findings had been finalised yet, no published findings had been made. And there was some discrepancy between 2 teams of scientists about the effect of this gene mutation. There was a Sydney team and a Canberra team, so they didn't agree on the effect of the gene mutation. But as I mentioned, the Europace article found quite conclusively in March 2021 that this gene mutation was lethal and most likely caused the death of her 2 daughters.
OK. So then let's go back to the beginning. She has spent 19 years in prison. She always has maintained her innocence, and she was convicted, am I right, not on the basis of any hard scientific evidence or medical evidence, but on the basis of something called Meadows Law.
You are right. Now, this Meadows Law is a defunct law out of Britain, and so the jury was told not to regard this law, but the defence team say that this law pervaded the tone of the trial and the subsequent inquiry in 2019. Now, this law basically states that 1 infant death is a tragedy, 2 is suspicious, and 3 or more must be murder unless proven otherwise. So basically the prosecution were arguing 4 deaths in 1 family, 2 suspicious, can't be a coincidence, must be murder. Even though there were no signs of smothering, the defence would argue, and scientists would say there were no signs of struggling. But this argument was led that it must be murder. So that was number one. And number two, the 2019 inquiry largely rested on Kathleen Folbig's journals, which were interpreted by the Honourable Reg Blanche to be virtual admissions of guilt because of some of the things that she wrote in those journals. Now, you might, I think you've got excerpts of some of them, but if you'd like to.
Yeah, let's
talk
play
about
those. Let's have a listen.
You killed them and you knew you had, but you wanted to try again and...
No, I didn't kill my children. And these diaries are a record of just how depressed and how much struggle I was having and all of the issues that go with that.
And so, Rachel, how significant were those diaries in her ultimate conviction?
The defence team argues very significant because it seems like the Honourable Reg Blanche used them to only cement his thinking that she was guilty beyond reasonable doubt. He wouldn't allow any expert evidence on these diaries. He said he knew how to interpret them. The defence has since told me, Kathleen Folbig's lawyers have said, well, that's unfair. How could he possibly understand the feelings of a woman, and a traumatised woman at that? Who was, as many mothers might tell you, lots of mums say at times, I think I'm a bad mum. And Kathleen Folbig's lawyers say these journals were just a place for her to outpour her grief. She felt like she had been a bad mum and she felt like her children had left her because she was a bad mum. But her lawyers say she wasn't confessing to a crime. So the idea of these journals and how they've been interpreted, and I think her lawyers tell me 40 words out of her journals were used, rather than the 50,000 in its entirety. So they were a very important part of the case, if you ask Kathleen Folbig's lawyers. And it'll be interesting to see if some of these diaries are scrutinised in the upcoming new inquiry.
Yeah. Sandy, for people who don't live in New South Wales, this has been a notorious case. But it's extraordinary to think that there is this very real prospect, it would seem, that this woman may well be innocent, and that in fact, she's been victimised in all of this. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing to even consider, isn't
it? Totally tragic. And I think as a mum, I think our biggest fear is ever outliving our children, do you know what I mean? But to outlive 4 would be totally devastating. And then to be accused of being a murderer, I just can't imagine how she must feel. Like, I just really can't even go there. Bad with 1, but 4, oh my God. And, to have that accusation, I can't even imagine what it would be like to be in jail with the other inmates thinking that she is a murderer of her own children as well. So she's had, just a absolutely shocking time, but it just seems that the whole system was not, she was not looked after, right from day one, where it seems that, where is the evidence? The evidence isn't there. As you said, if 1 has died, well then, and then 2, and then 3, well then it has to be murder. And that is the evidence. And that's, it's very sad. Years ago, I did actually take care of a particular very well-known person in Australia who was certainly accused of murdering her child as well in the Northern Territory. And, she was a really lovely woman, and she was just really crucified by the media at the time. And so she was found guilty that way as well. And when I heard of this, I did think of Lindy Chamberlain as well, on how she went to jail and spent time there.
And you're speaking, of course, of Lindy Chamberlain, yeah?
Yeah. I did her hair for a while when she first came out of jail. And, it was interesting just, what she went through. And so I think of this one too with Kathleen. My heart goes out to her, I'll be honest, as a mum, to lose any child, but then to be accused as well. So I think that this is obviously a very, very, very overdue inquest that needs to happen. Yeah.
Rachel, it's an extraordinary story. It's extraordinary to think that there'll be yet another inquiry. Who knows, maybe even another trial. Thank you so much for your information on it tonight.
Thanks, Alan.
Rachel Brown, ABC journalist. You're watching The Drum. With me on the panel, editor of The Guardian Australia, Lenore Taylor. In Newcastle, CEO of the Australian Hairdressing Council and Managing Director of Suki Hairdressing, Sandy Chong. In Melbourne, former Victorian Labor Premier Steve Bracks. And in Perth, former West Australian Liberal Premier Colin Barnett. New figures out today confirmed an uncomfortable truth for millions of Australians. Our take-home pay is buying less and less. Bureau of Statistics figures show workers' wages rose 2.4% over the past year. Now, that growth in pay is well below inflation or the cost of living, which is rising at 5.1%. The Drum's David Taylor looks at this yawning gap and what's on offer to close it.
The cost of living is a major focus of this election campaign. We know that what we pay for everyday household items is rising. And the rising cost of petrol has become particularly difficult for many household budgets to absorb.
What do we want? More than rent! When do we want it? Now!
So what about the other side of the equation, our pay? According to the latest measure from the Bureau of Statistics, known as the Wage Price Index, or WPI, workers' pay grew by 0.7% over the 3 months to March. That takes annual wage growth to 2.4%.
Wages are growing, but at a stagnant pace.
Private sector wages grew by 2.4% for the quarter. Employees bagged pay rises through regular salary reviews, while some in-demand skilled workers managed to bargain for relatively high pay rises by threatening to quit or by switching jobs. The contribution of enterprise agreements to overall pay rises remained relatively stable. Public sector wages grew 2.2%. Crucially, today's data on pay confirms many Australians are still going backwards. This chart shows the gap between what we earn at work and what that money buys for us is blowing out, putting pressure on households across the country.
The challenge is inflation. The wage rises we're seeing as a result of tightness in the labour market, unemployment falling, the lowest equal level in 48 years at 4%, which is unimaginable 5 years ago, 2 years ago.
Real wages have gone backwards yet again. A fall of 2.7%. What a hit. This delivers the biggest cuts to real wages in more than 20 years.
Going backwards, that is, the pace of your pay increases not keeping up with the cost of living, is a relatively new phenomenon. Over the past decade, though wages growth has been relatively flat, it has kept pace with inflation, even above. What's hurting workers at the moment, though, is the solution to going backwards is increasing productivity. But the evidence shows the higher the productivity, the greater the profits, not the higher the wages.
The takeaway message there is that the economy is growing and becoming more productive, but a higher fraction of the rewards of that higher productivity are being channeled into the hands of the owners of capital, so investors, employers, rather than into the hands of workers.
Most Australians deal with rent and mortgage repayments every month. Earlier this month, the Reserve Bank cited faster pay growth as a reason to raise interest rates. Today's ABS data shows, compared to the 3 months to December last year, overall wage growth is flat.
Steve Bracks, let's start with you this time. The ACTU says this is the worst real wages growth in more than 20 years. We all know that the cost of living is skyrocketing. How did we get here?
Well, we got here because we've had a government that hasn't set the right signals on what wage growth should be. In fact, every submission they've made to the Fair Work Commission has been for the most minimal wage rise to the minimum wage. Now that's always a good signpost. I know most of the wage growth comes from enterprise agreements, of course it does, but knowing that the government wants employers to pay less than the inflation rate, which they have demonstrated by their submissions to the Fair Work Commission, is really a policy prescription that they've had for the last 9 years, if you like, and certainly the last 3 years. I just find this whole debate quite confected, really. I can't see what's remarkable about a leader of a party saying that he wants wages to keep pace with inflation. Everyone knows in the workplace that when a wage claim goes in, it's usually a wage claim which is around the cost of living or inflation. That's what usually happens. So it's hardly a remarkable thing to say you want wages to keep pace with inflation. And to do less than that, I think, is effectively a wage cut, as we heard from the report. If you can't have your wages increasing at the rate of inflation, your purchasing power is less, and you are having effectively a wage cut.
Okay, Sandy, could you, as a small business operator, deal with a 5.1% pay increase?
No, we couldn't. And I think we have to, still remember, and I hate to bring it up, but, we've just gone through, the pandemic. And I think we sometimes have a short memory too. It was JobKeeper that really saved, like hundreds of thousands of businesses and individuals as well. So when I think about business at the moment for small business, we're in recovery at the moment, and we're very hopeful that that our businesses will recover in 2023. And when we look at the surveys and we look at the reports from, each of the governments that come through, small businesses are really relying on this year to just really try and get their cash flow back. And I guess, we've got to remember that the leasing code is finished now. So we've got deferred bills, we've got deferred leases, we've got a lot of costs that we have to, anticipate. Many small business owners actually earn less than their staff. And, I think a lot of people don't understand that. So when we talk about wage rise, we sort of go, well, then that means that I'm actually going to earn less as well. Please bear in mind, though, I think that everyone should be paid well. Everyone should be paid well, and everyone should be able to afford to live well in Australia. But I just think that when it comes from a small business perspective right now, we just really can't afford to pay out anything more when it comes to a wage rise or any other more expenses, because we're just too busy at the moment trying to get on top of things. I know so many businesses that still have staff off who have COVID. And even just this week, we've got two of our sellers that are asking me if they can have, is there any kind of grant that they can get, because they're actually closed because all their staff are still off with COVID. So we're still not quite out of there. We're getting out of there, but yeah, I think if someone said to me that my wages were going to increase by 5-point-something%, then I'd have to consider, can I keep all of my staff? Can I put on another staff member? Probably not. And when we talk about productivity, well, productivity does actually increase your turnover. But if it's going straight out the door, well, then, that just means that your KPIs have increased as well.
Colin, I mean, that's a compelling perspective from small business. But when you look at what the ABS release said today, it was pretty stark. The share of national income going to wages is going down, and the share of national income going to profits is going up. And I'm not including Sandy in that, but I note that earlier today you said as Premier it was your mission never to give a dollar to a mining company of public funds. So same question as to Steve Bracks. What do you think is happening here?
Well, I think Sandy's absolutely right as far as small business is concerned. I mean, people aren't really spending in those businesses as they were. The other point I'd make is that the higher inflation rate at the moment is probably a spike brought on by Russia-Ukraine war, brought on by a disruption to production of consumer goods. So I don't think that's the underlying rate of inflation. However, there's no doubt the lowest level of paid employees in Australia are really struggling, absolutely struggling. So I think there's got to be a bit of compromise here, and I would expect and maybe hope that the Fair Work Commission comes out with something like a 3% increase for the very lowest paid workers. I just think that's what a society should be able to do. But you're right, there's a lot of inequality going on now, and it's a very difficult time. So a moderate increase would start to see some correction of that, but you can't just throw in a 5 or 6 or 7% increase and expect jobs to survive. It wouldn't happen. It's
interesting, isn't it, Lenore? I mean, is this too simplistic? What Colin's just said about a 3% increase, that's 60 cents an hour on the minimum pay in this country of $20.33. What Mr Albanese is talking about, 5.1%, is $1 an hour. What, pick another one. The retailers are talking about 3.7, that's 75 cents an hour. ACTU, let me do the sum. I've got my phone out. Hopefully nobody calls me. 0.055. they're talking about $1.11 an hour. So, I mean, we're only talking about less than 2% of the population on the minimum wage. Why are we having a fight in this country about, 50 cents, 60 cents, 75 cents, $1 or $1.10?
Well, I don't think we necessarily should be, but I think the reason that we are is because increases in the minimum wage often either directly or by implication flow up to people who earn more than that. So I think that's interesting. The other point is that the wages haven't been working the way they normally do for quite a while. When unemployment is this low, normally wages would have started to pick up by now, and they're not. That link doesn't work as directly as it used to, and it hasn't been for quite some time. So people have felt this pinch a bit, and then when inflation spiked, they felt it a lot. And I think the interesting thing is that when Anthony Albanese said, yeah, wages should keep pace with inflation, the government thought he'd made a big mistake. But then pretty quickly they realised that they were then on the side of saying, no, your wages shouldn't keep pace with inflation, and they've had to sort of step it back a bit. And I think underneath it all is this breaking in what normally happens to wages when there's really low unemployment.
And that's bizarre, isn't it, Sandy? I mean, that's something that you must think about, the notion that, I mean, it must be tough to get staff. If all your staff came to you and said, righto, we're going unless you give us how much more an hour. And that's what the ABS is basically saying, is how people are getting pay rises in this country. They'll say, I'm going to hold my breath until I pass out unless you give me a wage rise.
Yeah, and I think that with many industries, it's a bit of an employees market out there at the moment who are really demanding a lot more money anyway. So they are getting, wage increases.
Are you seeing that though? Because I mean, it's only being seen in a small amount of the private sector, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Are you seeing that? Are your staff getting shirted?
Yeah, not my staff. I think that I actually pay my staff really well. I've had my staff for a really long time, up to 37 years, some of them, and 20-something years. But the thing is, when someone talks about wages, and I think what they forget is all the eligibilities that are not really discussed, or when we talk about downtime or personal leave, etc. And even when we're talking of late, and I believe it was on last night on the drum, the domestic violence paid leave. I mean, something like that, I 100% believe that someone who is a victim of domestic violence should have that paid leave. But I don't feel that it should come from a business owner. They should not be the ones that are paying it. It should come from somewhere like Centrelink. When I look at the paid domestic violence leave, what about small business owners like myself or any other business owner? And what about sole traders as well? Don't they matter? How come they miss out? So when we talk about wage rises and when we talk about wages, it's not just what someone gets in their hand the week that they work. There's all these other costs on there. There's generally 20% downtime. Then you've got all your eligibilities, your personal leave, your compassionate leave. And then soon we might have, domestic violence leave. It seems to be unending. And at the moment with the pandemic, it's like you're paying out personal leave or annual leave every week. And so there are all those extra costs. So when we talk about wages, we've got to talk about the whole wage, superannuation, everything else as well, that is not factored in when I think people talk about wages.
The thing that governments can influence, of course, is public sector wages. And they've been capped in most states and federally for a really long time. I think Labor has said that they would like to see public sector wages rise more in line with CPI, and that then also has flow-on effects to, privately negotiated EBAs, and that is directly in the gift of government, so they can make that happen.
And Colin, given that the Reserve Bank of Australia has been kind of hoping since 2017 and kind of praying for wage rises to commence, is that something that governments need to look at? What are the levers that they can pull? Because at the same time, you've got to remember, once this election's over, the business lobby is going to be screaming even louder to say, we don't have enough workers in this country. And we know from the Reserve Bank that an increase in migration of working age people puts downward pressure on wages.
Well, I guess on immigration, I think Australia should keep to a constant and significant immigration flow.
Do we have that now at 160,000?
Well, 160, 200, but keep it. That shouldn't be always up for speculation and change. I think we also should have a better developed guest worker program properly, fair to the people that come here, whether it's Pacific Islands, Southeast Asia. That will do a lot in terms of our standing in the region. And obviously government, I think, can do more and do better in some of the on-costs that we've just been talking about. So, yep, it's not an easy time, but that's the reality.
And public sector wage increases, as Lenore was saying?
Well, public sector employees do have a higher level of job security. You can freeze wages, and that's happened, and it's happened effectively in Western Australia, but you can only do that for a short period of time. And for example, you know, Western Australia is a bit of a boom-bust state. We have incredible troubles in this state keeping people like teachers and nurses when they can earn, you know, 50%, 100% more in the mining industry. So sometimes the government has to respond and increase wages quite significantly just to maintain essential services. So I don't think we can generalise too widely, but look, there is a shortage of labour, and those job increases, wage increases, I think will gradually flow through. So I expect you'll see wage rises really start to, and probably rise reasonably significantly over the next 12 months.
Steve Brax, that's what the Reserve Bank of Australia said in its reasoning for increasing interest rates last month. But apparently they were wrong.
Yeah, yes, well they did. They've now had to revise their forecast of when wage rises will occur, and I think they're saying by the end of next year is the likely time when wages are more likely to keep pace with inflation. But look, I think we're kidding ourselves if we think there's not going to be a 5.1% rise. Just think about every workplace in this country. And when an enterprise agreement comes up, what do you think the first claim is going to be? It's going to be to match inflation, to match the cost of living.
But isn't the problem that we don't have enough enterprise bargaining in this country? I mean, the ABS said today jobs covered by individual arrangements continue to be the largest contributor to wage growth in recent quarters, but enterprise bargaining is at its lowest ebb in, what, 20, 25 years?
It is, but it needs to change, and I think it will change, knowing that inflation is increasing significantly. And I think
what, people will just magically start making enterprise agreements?
No, they won't. But industries will say that effectively the wage rise they want is one to keep pace with the cost of living, and I think that'll be a compelling case going forward, industry by industry. And you know from your own workplace that's likely to be the case.
I mean, it's interesting, Lenore, because, I mean, enterprise bargaining, that notion where people would sit down, just as Sandy was talking about, immediately the word that comes up is productivity. If you can ramp up productivity, I can pay you more. That system has basically fallen apart in Australia. And that was part of the big IR reform that fell over. That was supposed to be the great, we can do anything if we work together, the COVID dividend, we can think big. And the whole of it fell over. I mean, does either of the major parties have any plan to really tackle industrial relations reform in a way that would get that going again?
Well, I mean, I'm interested to see if Anthony Albanese is elected and goes through and, you know, makes good with his having a summit between business and unions to talk about all of these issues, what can come of that.
But isn't that what the coalition did in the dark days of COVID? Well, Sandy's nodding away. Cosboa was there, weren't they?
Yes, they did, but then they didn't do what the people at the summit advised them to do. Like, they didn't implement what the summit said to do. So, you know, if he goes ahead with that, it will be interesting to see, because I think it's in the interest of both business and the unions to come to some resolution on this. Like, it really is, you know, it's in everyone's interest to try to come to an agreement.
And Sandy, is that something? I mean, you've had dealings with Small Business Council as well. Is there the appetite for that, or did we just waste a crisis? Because I know that Peter Strong, who, you know, you have dealings with from the Council of Small Businesses Australia, formerly, those people, all the retailers, all of them put in hours and hours and hours to try and get a deal, and they didn't get a deal.
No, I think it was only the casual. There were thinking back, I think there were 5 separate committees that were working on the industrial relations. It was only the casual one that actually got through. And I mean, it was hours of work and days of work and people traveling to all these meetings and, you know, to try and make things happen. So that was when Christian Porter was the Attorney General. And I mean, we were all quite gobsmacked. I must admit that what a waste of time that was. And it was very, very disappointing as well that, that nothing really came of it. It was like, what was the point of all of that, in fact?
Well, just quickly for those watching, Lenore, does this dismal wage figure have any impact on what the Reserve might do next month with interest rates?
Well, I'm not an economist, but I guess it probably slightly lowers the chance of a big interest rate hike because, you know, when they raised rates, the RBA said, oh, they weren't going to wait for this data because their surveys were showing that wages were already starting to rise. So, you know, I guess rate rises are aimed at slowing demand. You know, if your wages aren't keeping up with inflation, that's probably happening a bit anyway. So I guess it would factor in a slightly, you know, muting. The increases are still going to happen, but it might sort of have a downward pressure effect.
A less big increase. If you are still on the lookout for some peace and quiet, you are not alone. It turns out there is a growing demand for a lack of chit-chat when it comes to getting a haircut. In fact, some hair salons are now offering pre-appointment questionnaires asking whether you would like to chat or you'd prefer silence. Sydney hairdresser Ash Boughton told The Guardian last week that silent haircuts are experiencing a massive uptick since the pandemic. She said that some people just don't want conversation and prefer the time to zen out. Isn't that a bit rude, Sandy, that you walk in and go, cut the hair, don't talk to me? No talking.
Well, I don't think they really sort of put it that way. Well, you know, in all the years that I've done hairdressing, I've not had anyone say, you know, don't talk to me. Look, it takes all types, I think, really, doesn't it? And when we think about a visit to the hairdressing salon, you know, for many of us, it's an escape from reality. And, you know, it's their sort of sanctuary and it's their time out. So some like to really chit and chat. And, you know, for others, it's actually their social, you know, it's their social outing, literally. There are others who, you know, we recognise that some people are really lonely and they really like to have a chat. But I think that, you know, with the mental stress that's around at the moment as well, and just with work commitments, whatever, there's certainly, you know, there's certainly clients that come in and it's like, you know what, I just want time out. I do remember going to a beauty salon years ago and I was really quite surprised in their consultation form where it said, would you like to have a quiet appointment? And I asked them about that and I actually thought it was a fantastic idea. That was in the beauty industry. The interesting thing is since this has come up, the Australian Hairdressing Council has a very active social media page and we've got quite a few of them. So we asked the question to our members and, you know, I guess to the industry about the silent appointments. Some hairdressers actually sort of would be really good if we could tell the clients to be quiet too. And so, you know, to be honest, some of them can really chat. But look, I think chat or chill is, you know, look, it's certainly something that I think that a hairdresser who is a really good hairdresser can read the room. They can read their client. I mean, if I had a client who just loved to chat all the time, but then she was quiet, I'd probably be a little bit concerned as to whether she's okay. But on the other hand, if someone is quite happy to sit there, and I'm actually one of them too, to be honest, I'm quite happy to have my hair done and actually not say anything. So I quite appreciate just that quiet time too.
Let me just talk to Lenore. I mean, this is really interesting, but what you don't think about is people like Sandy are these amazing hairdressers come psychologists come social workers, because before the pandemic, these amazing figures, 80% of hairdressers say they've had someone divulge a mental health issue to them, and 50% say they've had people divulge family and domestic violence. So there's this incredible role that they play in this intimate setting where they're touching you about what goes on between us. And so what does our desire to be silent say about us?
Well, I don't know that everybody does desire to be silent. I mean, my hairdresser Mario knows how to read the room, you know, and I like chatting with him because he does know all the neighbourhood goings on, and it's a good way of sort of a touchstone with somebody who does talk to a lot of people. But then there are times when it's better to be quiet, like hair washing and the head massage.
And how do you signal that to Mario?
He knows how to read the room.
But how do you do it?
I just shut my eyes and go quiet.
You pretend to be asleep, Lenore.
I do not. I just kind of, you know.
You signal that. I end up having conversations I don't want to have.
Do you?
Yeah, I'm
Maybe
bad
shut
at
your
that.
eyes.
Shut your eyes, pretend to be asleep. Steve and Colin, we scoured the political landscape for two former premiers with hair. So thank you for being here. I mean, that's possibly not the only reason that you're here. Do you have anything to contribute to this, Steve? What do you do as in the barber?
my hairdresser has been in Williamstown for about 30 years and he knows everything about the suburb, which is great. Sam Ricardo, he's fantastic. So I go to him regularly, and you would not be surprised, in Melbourne, what we talk about is our AFL teams. I talk to him about Geelong, he talks about the Western Bulldogs, and we have animated discussions, as you could imagine. And I love it actually. I think it's great, and I'd hate to have a situation where we were just sitting there saying nothing.
Yeah.
Plenty of discussion in my hairdresser.
Okay, Colin, you got 30 seconds.
Well, I go to a men's hairdresser, owned and managed by a woman, and Josie says enough for both of us. I just sit there and mumble every now and again.
You realise now that you're going to have to find another hairdresser having said that. You cannot say that about your hairdresser. And she does a good job too. Good luck, Colin. That is all we have time for. Thank you so much to our panel, to Lenore Taylor, to Sandy Chong. Sandy, thank you so much for being with us. Great discussion tonight. Steve Bracks, and in Perth tonight, Colin Barnett. Julia Baird is with you tomorrow night. Only a couple of sleeps now till the election. Hang in there. Have a great night. Good night to you.
For the latest on the federal election, go to ABC News Digital.
Policy announcements and how they impact you.
Profiles of every electorate, including yours.
Anthony Green's guide to the key seats.
You Ask, We Answer is back, and you can see what other Australians are asking.
There's our new Get Ready to Vote checklist, plus live blogs and notifications so you won't miss a thing.
For election news that matters to you, go to abc.net.au/Australia Votes or download the ABC News app.
Tonight, wages return to the centre of the election contest, with new figures showing they're growing at half the rate of inflation. New South Wales announces another inquiry into a mother's conviction over the deaths of her 4 children. Uncertainty surrounds the fate of Ukrainian fighters evacuated from a steelworks plant in Mariupol. And Shayna Jack caps off a stunning return to the pool at the Australian Swimming Championships. Good evening, Yvonne Yong with ABC News. Just 3 days out from the election, the cost of living has again dominated campaigning. Data shows wages are growing with an annual rise of 2.4%, but that's less than half the rate of inflation. Labor leader Anthony Albanese is blaming the government for bad economic management. The Prime Minister argues soaring inflation is a global challenge.
When sure-footed defence fails, when stamina runs down, break out the bulldozer and flatten them all before you. All over the pitch and all at odds with a campaign built around easing pain.
Here we go.
His opponent proving hits can come without laying a finger.
The biggest cuts to real wages in more than 20 years.
We're seeing those wages start to rise again, but the challenge is inflation.
The latest wage figures showing pay packets increased by 0.7% in the March quarter and 2.4% over the year, less than half the 5.1% rise in the cost of living over the same period.
Australian workers are paying the price for a decade of bad policy and economic failures.
Scott Morrison pointing to the war in Europe to explain painfully high inflation.
It's one of the biggest shocks to the global economy, if not the biggest we've seen since the 1970s.
Economic management the focus for the final week of the election campaign. With Labor not releasing its costings until tomorrow, the coalition's decided to get in early.
Altogether, the Labor Party have racked up some $440 billion in additional spending pressures.
And exactly what did he count to conjure a figure so big?
Through nods and winks to the states and territories.
No one there to nod or wink in agreement.
The only way to change Australia for the better is to change the government this Saturday.
He does seem to be getting a bit ahead of himself. And, you know, Australians will make this decision, Anthony. You don't get to make it before the election.
In a nod to budget repair, Anthony Albanese revealed a couple of savings today worth $750 million. But that's not the whole picture. Labor's costings will likely show higher deficits than the coalition alternative. The ALP will argue its spending will boost productivity, judging that when the nation already has a $1 trillion IOU, tackling debt might not be the pressing issue it once was. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
For workers faced with the rising cost of living, wages can't go up fast enough. But for now, the only sure thing on the cards is another rate hike.
After working as a chef for 2 decades, Scott Bowerman started a labour hire business. He says many workers in hospitality still don't get paid above the minimum wage.
I've been in the industry for 20 years and it hasn't changed. It's stuck in the early 80s.
The annual wage growth was weighed down by sluggish rises in the public sector. The only industry that saw an annual pay rise above 3% was real estate. It means pay packets are rising well below the average level of 3.1%.
This is the largest real wage fall that we've seen in many years, and it's likely to get worse before it gets better.
Consumer prices are increasing more than twice the pace of wages and have been growing faster than pay packets for the past year.
For many employers across Australia, staff only make up about 25% of business costs, although it is higher in some sectors like hospitality. But across industries, a 5% pay rise to keep up with the cost of living isn't likely to push prices up by the same amount. But inflation will continue to be a problem, which means another rate hike next month.
We think it's more likely we'll see another 25 basis point hike because the RBA is still quite focused on seeing wage growth accelerate.
And in some industries, it is already. Bonnie Kalapouris is willing to pay more to attract staff to work at her dental practice.
To get that staff, you do sort of need to match those rates if you do want to get access to that small pool that's available.
As the cost of living continues to rise, workers are counting the pay offers will eventually catch up. Nassim Khadem, ABC News.
New South Wales has announced a new public inquiry into the conviction of Kathleen Folbig over the deaths of her 4 children. Folbig remains behind bars over the murder of 3 children and the manslaughter of a 4th. Various court appeals since then have failed, and an inquiry in 2019 reinforced her guilt. The Attorney-General says another inquiry is needed to examine new scientific evidence suggesting a genetic mutation could be responsible for the deaths of 2 of the children.
That doesn't mean that I formed any view as to the guilt or innocence of Ms Folbig, nor as to whether there is any reasonable doubt about her conviction. But certainly there is enough of a question or doubt that this new scientific evidence raises that justifies some form of intervention.
But he resisted calls from Folbig's lawyers for a pardon, saying that was inappropriate. Western Australia has recorded more than 16,000 new COVID cases today. The numbers are making vulnerable communities anxious, particularly since the relaxation of mask rules.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, that's lovely. Thank you.
For some, morning tea is the only time in public they take their masks off.
We always wear our masks.
Yeah, I think we're going to wear ours for a while yet. Yeah.
I'll walk in the streets without a mask, but I certainly wouldn't with all these people around.
Since the mask mandate was lifted, leaving the house is a source of anxiety for some older West Australians. At this event at the Perth Town Hall, crowds have almost halved.
It's, I don't know, it's just that uncertain time. So we haven't really got back to normal as yet. Sometimes families encourage them not to come because they're more likely to catch it.
Come on, we can put you in now. It's not just the CBD which seniors are avoiding. This entire gymnasium used to be full of carpet bowlers.
I'd hate for any of my people to come down with COVID because I've taken them out bowling.
While some vulnerable people are choosing to stay home because of the risks, others are still choosing to go out.
You'll see a lot of people here today wearing their masks, but they also know that the secret of life is getting out and having a go.
We can't believe it.
Christine Allen's mother is one of those who thinks it's not a risk worth taking.
She feels that she may not survive if she gets COVID.
She implores people to consider the vulnerable when making decisions about masks and other measures.
I don't know that it should be mandated that we all wear them, but certainly think of people who are at higher risk than you are.
A nervous time for many, with case numbers expected to continue climbing. Kason Ho, ABC News.
The fate of hundreds of Ukrainian fighters evacuated from a steel plant in Mariupol remains unclear after they surrendered to Russian forces. Several more buses carrying soldiers from the factory have been driven to Russian-controlled territory. The severely wounded are being treated in hospital, while others have been sent to a penal colony near Donetsk. The soldiers fought for almost 3 months in what became a symbol of Ukrainian resistance. More than 260 troops are now in Russian hands, with some yet to be evacuated. Ukraine's hoping they'll be part of a prisoner swap. North Korea has sent in the army to lead its response to a COVID outbreak as the virus sweeps through its unvaccinated population. But offers of outside help are still being ignored.
As fever cases sweep across the country, state television reveals a confident commander-in-chief leading the way. Presiding over a Politburo meeting, cigarette in hand, Kim Jong-un accused his officials of being inadequate and slammed their response to the first confirmed COVID-19 outbreak as immature. There's speculation this parade, marking 90 years of the country's military, was a super spreader event. Huge crowds, unmasked and not socially distanced. Soon after, the nation's non-existent vaccine program and severe lack of medical supplies were exposed.
We lacked awareness and understanding of the disease and did not know how to treat it.
It's impossible to pin down the extent of the outbreak in the secretive nation. North Korea has confirmed more than 1.7 million cases of fever, but it says the virus situation is taking a favourable turn. The armed forces have been mobilised, and according to state media, treatments ranging from painkillers to home remedies are working.
We were sick, but every night and morning I made us gargle with salt water.
It's what's not being shown that has experts worried.
You need antivirals. They don't have that. I'm certain of it. It's a matter of incredible urgency that we get the pills to them as soon as possible.
But offers of vaccines are being met with silence.
The regime is probably worried about the optics of it, the optics that the regime is not capable enough.
It's just terrible, you know, there's 26 million people who are already living under one of the harshest regimes in the world, and now they're facing this terrible health situation on top.
North Korea is desperately poor, with almost half the population undernourished. The United Nations has warned that locking down the country would have dire consequences for those already struggling to feed their families. James Oaten, ABC News.
Australia's wool producers are attempting to cut the thousands of tonnes of carbon emissions they generate every year. One of the big contributors to that is transport. So some Tasmanian producers have hopped on board a novel way of taking wool to market.
An unusual journey for precious cargo.
It's one of those things when it's suggested, you sort of think, OK, I'll go with that.
These bales of low methane merino wool have been pedalled hundreds of kilometres from Tasmania's northern Midlands to Hobart and will travel hundreds more to Geelong on board this sailboat. It's a one-off exercise by a fashion brand to see how close they can get to zero carbon wool.
It's an extreme example that makes us think. And through the thinking process, perhaps we can make little steps which will lead to big steps to improve things throughout the whole supply chain.
Australia provides a quarter of the world's wool. The industry is worth $3.4 billion. Consumers are demanding a more sustainable product, and part of that comes down to transportation.
It is the most significant
contributor to emissions from a manufacturing point of view. But again, the important thing to note is that is a very small fraction of time in the life cycle of a woolen garment.
While carbon emissions are front of mind for many producers, it's not the only piece of the environmental puzzle. Some farmers are looking to other, less quantifiable factors.
It is absolutely critical in wool and across all industries that we have lower greenhouse gas emissions. While it is a really critical part of the story, it's not the only factor. So we also need to make sure that we're looking at other things such as biodiversity.
Colette Glazik and her family are planting thousands of shrubs on their sheep property annually.
We want to provide habitat for both insects, birds and other mammals.
From farm to arm with the smallest possible footprint. Erin Cooper, ABC News.
Briefly to sport now, an Australian swimmer, Shayna Jack, has placed second in the women's 100-metre freestyle event at the Australian Swimming Championships in Adelaide. Her second spot guarantees her selection for the Australian team for the World Championships and Commonwealth Games later this year. It's the first time she's made an Australian team since she ended her 2-year ban for taking a prohibited drug. The race was won by Molly O'Callaghan, who set the fastest time in the world this year. And for a look at the weather, here's Paul Higgins.
Well, tomorrow the rain that's been falling over Western Australia into South Australia will weaken out, and gusty winds and showers in the southeast will also ease as the high moves further east and ridges in. But that high is going to increase onshore winds over the Queensland coast, and together with an approaching upper level trough, it'll cause some showers to ramp up there, especially Friday and Saturday. Thursday in Perth and in Brisbane there'll be a shower or two, and in Melbourne just a chance of a shower on a partly cloudy day. Sydney will have blue skies. In Canberra, a frosty -1 degree start to your day. In Hobart, a possible shower. Adelaide will be mostly sunny, and sunny in Darwin.
That's the latest from ABC News. I'm Yvonne Yong. Have a good evening.
Welcome to The Business. I'm Catherine Robinson. Coming up on the program, real wages scrambling to keep up with price hikes in the final days of the cost of living election.
I've been in the industry for 20 years and it hasn't changed. It's stuck in the early 80s.
And the headache for the new government, how to deal with weak wages while juggling rising interest rates and inflation.
What policymakers ought to be focused on is reform measures that will lift productivity growth over time.
Today's hotly anticipated wage numbers show base salaries creeping up to 2.4% for the year. The weakest growth since the introduction of the GST means annual salaries are going backwards, chasing a 5% jump in the cost of living. And with purchasing power in reverse, there are warnings there's no quick political fix. This report from Nassim Hadem.
After working as a chef for 2 decades, Scott Bowerman started a labour hire business. He says many workers in hospitality still don't get paid above the minimum award rate.
I've been in the industry for 20 years and it hasn't changed. It's stuck in the early 80s.
Scott says many people left the sector during the pandemic.
COVID has really hit the industry hard. It's knocked a lot of hospitality staff out of hospitality and they just haven't looked back.
Wages rose just 0.7% in the March quarter and 2.4% over the year. It was weighed down by sluggish growth in the public sector. The only industry that saw an annual pay rise above 3% was real estate. It means pay packets are rising well below the average level of 3.1%.
Workers are certainly seeing their purchasing power fall quite substantially. This is the largest real wage fall that we've seen in many years, and it's likely to get worse before it gets better.
Consumer prices are increasing more than twice the pace of wages and have been growing faster than pay packets for the past year.
Inflation is the challenge. You've got to know the things you can't control. Global events, global forces, oil prices, wars in Europe, disruptions of supply chains from the pandemic, shutdowns in China.
Under Scott Morrison, real wages are plummeting while the costs of living are skyrocketing.
For many employers across Australia, staff only make up about 25% of business costs, although it is higher in some sectors like hospitality. But across industries, a 5% pay rise to keep up with the cost of living isn't likely to push prices up by the same amount. Economists say the latest data should mean less pain for mortgage borrowers.
I think we're unlikely to see a supersized rate hike in June. We think it's more likely we'll see another 25 basis point hike because the RBA is still quite focused on seeing wage growth accelerate.
The Reserve Bank has seen evidence of more firms reporting pay rises above 3%. One employer willing to fork out more is Bonnie Kalapouris.
Hey Vicky. To get that staff, you do sort of need to match those rates if you do want to get access to that small pool that's available.
She says even support staff are now attracting higher rates.
Some miniature applicators would be good too. A lot of practices at the moment, the hourly rate they're offering is 20 to 30% above what we would have been looking at a few years ago.
In other sectors, workers are shifting jobs to get pay rises. Canberra-based data analyst Adam Stephen-Slade spent his life working in defence. Now he's heading business operations for a racing industry information service.
There was an opportunity to move to a new and exciting industry, as well as get a little bit of a pay bump, so about 10%.
While Adam can keep up with the cost of living, he recognises the vast majority of Australians can't.
Nassim Hadem there. The March wage number has disappointed on the downside with sluggish salary growth despite a jobless rate at a near 50-year low. So what's the future for pay packets and the RBA's next move on rates? HSBC Chief Economist Paul Bloxham joined me earlier. Paul Bloxham, welcome to The Business.
Good to be here.
So today's number shows that the gap between wages and inflation is not closing. What is the consequence of today's wages numbers for workers and for employers?
Well, in fact, the numbers show that it's widening quite substantially. I mean, the last inflation print we got for the first quarter said that it was running at 5.1%. Today's wage numbers suggest that wages growth is only running at 2.4%. So real wages are going backwards and going backwards quite substantially, on at least on that metric. So the first consequence is, of course, people have less income to spend in real terms on things that they spend money on. There's a hit to disposable income in real terms. And so that's one aspect. That may very well be why we're seeing a weakening in consumer sentiment at the moment. It's weakened partly because people have got less take-home pay relative to the rise in the cost of living. But also, in addition to that, of course, we've seen interest rates start to rise. So that's one aspect of the story. Another is, of course, those weak real wage growth will encourage workers to demand higher wages. So we may very well see that there will be a pickup in wages over time.
When we look at the election campaign, wages have dominated in the last couple of days and a little bit longer as well. When you look at both of the major parties' policies, how would you assess their positions with respect to wages and their broader economic implications?
I think it's quite disappointing, actually, because I think the larger part of what we're listening to is a lot of measures to try to sort of improve the cost of living, the direct measures that are taken. There's a discussion being had about how much wages growth should be lifted and how much the minimum wage should be lifted, for example. But I don't think there's nearly enough focus on the key thing, which is to lift productivity growth. We need to be doing reform, tax reform, competition policy reform, climate and energy policy reform, all these sorts of things that would lead to stronger productivity growth. Because if you get a lift in wages without a lift in productivity growth, it's purely inflationary. What you really need to be focused on, what policymakers ought to be focused on, is reform measures that will lift productivity growth over time. That's the only way we lift living standards in the medium term.
Well, both the Coalition and Labor have promised to lift productivity, and we know that is the key to raising wages. What is the key to delivering productivity growth away from politics?
Well, I think that there are some big picture things that most economists, there's a consensus amongst economists, ought to be focused on. One of them is tax reform. It has been something that has been discussed, and we've done reviews. And if you go back, you can go back to the Henry Review, which is over a decade ago, and look at a long list of things that we really need to do to the tax system. We really haven't done many of those things. Another is competition policy. We need to have a look at competition again. It's been reviewed previously, and we haven't taken a lot of the measures in that area. And of course, we need to look at growth opportunities for Australia too, including in the climate and energy space. These are the sorts of things we ought to be talking about more. And of course, we're in an election campaign that's focused on a lot of other things.
You mentioned rates before. Before we look at the future, if we can just have a little look at the past, when you're looking at today's wages data, what does it say about the RBA's position on rates? Has it moved too soon, too slow, or has it gotten policy just right?
Well, it's interesting because the RBA said that for a while that what they were going to do was wait to see wages growth pick up at a 3 to 4% rate before they might start to lift their cash rate. And of course, what we saw earlier this month is they decided actually to lift their cash rate anyway. And so what's happened is in the interim, inflation has picked up a lot more than the RBA expected. And so they, despite the fact that they were saying they were going to be really focused on wages, they've really lifted rates because they're much more concerned about the inflation breakout that's already happened. I think there are hints in some of the more timely surveys of wages that wages growth is really getting going just in the last couple of months. But today's numbers weren't particularly strong. I mean, there's a lift going on, but it wouldn't be enough to get the RBA in and of itself over the line. It was the inflation story that got them going.
So now they've got the wages data from today. What do you expect they will do in the future with respect to rate hikes?
I think the RBA is now have now turned into being inflation fighters, at least in the short run. I mean, inflation's running a lot hotter than they expected, and I think the RBA has given fairly clear guidance they intend to lift interest rates a few more times to try to tackle the inflation challenge. For us, we think that they'll probably lift rates in June and then July and then August, but we're not quite as convinced that the RBA is going to lift interest rates as far as the market is suggesting. The market is suggesting at the moment that the cash rate could be 2.8% by the end of the year, which is a substantially higher level than we currently are. We're at 35 basis points. We don't think that's likely because we think the RBA, having lifted rates as much as we think, a bit less than that, a fair bit less than that, we think that will get some momentum. That will slow things down, especially given, of course, consumer sentiment's weakening, and we've had this pickup in inflation that's cutting into real incomes. And also, I mean, we think house prices are going to start to decline in a way that slows growth. So we don't think we think the RBA is going to go hard for the next couple of months, or next 3 months, and then start to really assess whether they need to do more than that.
Okay, so if the RBA is going to go hard in the next couple of months and then reassess, which is your assumption there, what will that mean for wages?
Well, the wages story's probably got a bit more momentum than today's figures suggest. So I would say wages growth is going to start to head towards that 3% sort of rate on the wage price index. We don't think we're going to get there till later this year or early next year. But the key thing here is with inflation where it is and wages where they are, this is going to continue to weigh, I think, on households' willingness to spend. And again, it's a bit circular because in essence, it's that argument that is the reason we don't think the RBA will lift interest rates very much, because they won't be able to, because the economy is already faced with something that's going to slow it down, which is this fall in real wages that's going on.
Paul Bloxham, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Fortescue Metals founder Andrew Twiggy Forrest has announced he'll be taking a more hands-on role at his company as part of a shake-up of the leadership team. As executive chairman, the mining billionaire will lead the company's iron ore business again for the first time since 2011. Dr Forrest will temporarily replace outgoing Chief Executive Elizabeth Gaines, who announced her intention to retire from the top leadership role in December until a permanent replacement is found. Ms Gaines will remain on the board of Fortescue and become the global brand ambassador for the company's green energy business, Fortescue Future Industries. To the markets, where tech stocks and commodities were on the rise. The All Ordinaries and ASX 200 both up 1%. And the Australian dollar dipped on those wages numbers. It's buying around 70 US cents. I spoke to David Bassanese from Beta Shares after the market closed. David, how did the market react to the wages data?
Well, I think the initial reaction was positive in the sense that the degree of RBA rate increases expected, over coming months has been scaled back a little bit. So it was positive for markets at the margin. Aussie dollar weakened a little bit as a consequence as well.
And how did the rest of the market perform today?
Look, the market was up today. There's a couple of positive, well, apart from the wages numbers today, Wall Street was up last night, so that was a good lead for our market. Also some positive news with regard to the miners. We had BHP up strongly today, looking to benefit from the shortages of fertiliser globally. They announced a major expansion of a fertiliser mine in Canada. So more broadly, what we're seeing is our mining sector benefiting from the strength of commodity prices around the world and looking to expand.
And David, tech stocks were back in favour.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen overnight that the Nasdaq in the US has bounced strongly. In fact, it's bounced strongly for the last couple of days. So markets have been deeply oversold in recent weeks, fears of interest rate increases in the United States. But there's been a bit of a bounce back, and in turn, that's helped our tech sector today.
Now, there was an interesting international survey out, the American Global Fund Manager survey from Bank of America. It's shown that sentiment has really shifted.
Well, I think fund managers around the world are getting quite nervous about the outlook, and they're raising their cash levels. I mean, many fund managers are still quite invested in the market, but it's certainly going. There's certainly a level of nervousness that is growing around the world, and that's been reflected in the shift in sentiment by many professional fund managers.
And just finally, David, what are you particularly keeping your eye out for the rest of the week and going into next week, both domestically and internationally?
Well, we do get some labour market numbers here in Australia tomorrow, likely to show continued pretty good employment growth. Unemployment ticking under 4%, historic lows in terms of unemployment. In the US, the real key now is the degree to which the economy starts to soften. So we're getting numbers on the housing sector, retail spending, the manufacturing indices. So markets are now focused on the degree to which the US economy is going to start to slow. So that's, I think, going to be a real focus over the rest of this week and in coming weeks.
David Bassanisi, thank you for your time.
Good to be with you.
And that's all from The Business. For more on those stories, head to the ABC News website and click on the business page, and you can catch the program anytime on iView. I'm Catherine Robinson. Thanks for joining me.
He'd love to be the next Prime Minister, wouldn't he?
That's the plan.
The clock ticking down to polling day. Just 2 weeks to go until Australians head to the polls.
This contest is getting very personal.
Amidst the spin, stunts and stumbles, the two leaders have tried to sharpen their pitch.
A better government which will deliver a better future.
Strong economy for a stronger future. Vote Liberal May 21.
Both sides of politics turned their focus to winning the votes of Australian women.
Today's campaign pledges were focused on Mother's Day.
Meeting mums and bums on Mother's Day.
Happy Mother's Day, Mum.
Beautiful day for Mother's Day.
Go on, away.
Political leaders are preparing to do battle in tonight's great debate, both men with something to prove.
Leaders unleashing on everything from cost of living,
national security, climate change,
aged care and management of the pandemic.
So tonight, the leaders of the two major parties are facing off. And welcome.
Looks a bit like that. There's nothing on it.
Prices go up.
Well, it's just not right. No, you won't, even though you say it'll be higher.
Scott Morrison, you say that people know you, so why don't they trust you?
But just because you've got a new set of glasses, how can we believe that you're a reformed man?
We're back in a moment.
Most people spend their lives trying to block politics out. So if you tuned in for the first thing you're seeing this election campaign to that second debate and saw Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese essentially shouting at each other, I'm not sure what you would have taken out of that to work out who to vote for.
If you tune in, I don't know very many people outside of this place that have actually watched either of the debates, but certainly if they did, I don't know what they would have actually made of it.
It actually rated quite well. About 1 million people watched that shouty Sunday slugfest, which was kind of fascinating but horrific in parts. 3 days later, they've all changed their tactic. They've realised doesn't look very statesman-like. And I thought Wednesday's was really good. We did learn about the two men.
What is the one strength, Mr Prime Minister, that you find in this gentleman?
Well, the thing about Anthony that I've always admired is that he's never forgot where he's come from.
So now you.
He was trying there.
Yep.
Well, Scott's absolutely committed to his nation.
What was confirmed by both events was that Scott Morrison's on top of his detail, but is very combative. Anthony Albanese talks more about the
vibe.
The vibe. He's more emotive in his language, not so flash on the details. But that's been the basically one of the campaign themes.
We heard Anthony Albanese really try and make a point out of showing how he understands the sort of day-to-day impacts of those economic situations that might occur, mentioning steak over mincemeat, wanting to show that I get what it means for families who are doing it tough.
Yeah, rather than the smart end of the street, he's looking at the people who might be cleaning the street. That's Anthony Albanese's mission, to bring it down to the real basics.
Yeah, Labor wants this to be fought on wages. They see themselves as the party that can make the case for improving everyone's situation. Whether or not they execute their arguments as polished as they would like is another question.
Australians will have their first chance to cast their ballots in person this morning.
Around 550 early voting centres open across the country.
And now more than ever, leaders need to be on message and cutting through to voters.
Tensions have also resurfaced inside the Liberal Party over religious discrimination laws.
The point is, it doesn't happen. The religious schools themselves don't wish to do that.
I'm astonished that he has walked away from that.
And I will stick with my position because I believe in the protection of gay and trans youth. Absolutely.
At the start of the campaign, we expected a lot of the focus would be on Western Australia and Queensland. Interestingly though, you've seen Scott Morrison spending a whole lot of time in suburban Sydney, where it's clear that he is hoping that there is a suburban, safe Labor territory that he can tackle into, using religion as a potential device to attract those votes.
Yeah, Scott Morrison couldn't get the religious discrimination legislation through the last parliament. He says he's committed to doing it again this time, although members of his own party say or have suggested at least, that they're willing to cross the floor again, because he's not saying if he's going to strengthen the protections in the Sex Discrimination Act for gay and trans youth. So I guess I can't pretend to be in Scott Morrison's mind, but it seems that some people think that the reason he's doing that is to speak to those suburban electorates that voted no to same-sex marriage, because he sees that there's perhaps value in at least saying that the government would act on strengthening protections for people of faith.
And so that's why you've seen these moderate Liberals in the fight of their lives come out publicly say, we will continue to agitate in our party for what we believe in. That's why you need to re-elect us, so there's a moderate voice inside a coalition.
And that's what's really interesting about this. Scott Morrison damn well knows what the view of the moderate Liberals is, and yet he's constantly needling on all those fronts. On Catherine Deves, he knows how aggravating it is to certain Liberals for him to back her in continuously.
So much time is being spent speaking about women's safety and fairness in sport, and people have made the point that little is being said about the real issue here, where it's women are at risk of violence within their own homes in this country, and yet all the emphasis is on this nebulous issue that nobody is actually raising.
So he knows the moderates' view, and yet he willfully does the exact opposite. He's doing it for tactical and political reasons.
And the trouble that he potentially has is, yes, if this does work in some suburban seats and it gets him, say, a seat like Parramatta in Western Sydney, the damage that it could do in those teal seats that have been safe Liberals means it's a net negative for him.
Today the PM has again stood by his candidate Catherine Deves after she doubled down on her controversial comments about transgender children.
That was inappropriate.
Look, that is actually the correct medico-legal term.
Catherine Deves diverted the Prime Minister's daily media conference.
I think it's very important we're sensitive about these issues. Very important.
Minors can't undergo that surgery in Australia.
Sophie, the Prime Minister's returned here to Tassie. It's the third time this election campaign. We're in Lyons, which is a Labor seat. It is marginal. There's Bass and Braddon. Now, Bass, the Prime Minister's visited a number of times, again today, making a mental health announcement with Bridget Archer, who's the MP there.
Yeah, and we have seen them appear together before during the campaign, but I think today's press conference was quite unusual because we saw Bridget Archer become quite emotional when they were making this mental health announcement, because she started opening up about her own battles with mental mental health, talking about what she's gone through with anxiety, and she actually even revealed as she was arriving at the event today, she actually had a panic attack. So I thought it was very kind of raw and honest from Bridget Archer, but that ended up leading to questions about the mental health of transgender children. And of course, the reason for that is because she was one of the MPs who crossed the floor to vote against the government's religious discrimination bill because she believed it didn't do enough to protect trans kids.
What are your concerns for that community when it comes to their mental health?
When we talk about people, whoever they are, that we should do so with kindness.
It's something that is distracting from the messages that Scott Morrison would rather be talking about.
I think he doesn't mind talking about it sometimes as well. It's almost a bit of a culture war issue that he's happy to engage in, and he appears quite comfortable and willing to answer those questions. Does this affect polling day on May 21? You know, do voters decide, no, we don't like this Liberal candidate, therefore even in our electorate, 200 k's away, we're not going to vote Liberal? Or do voters not really engage in the culture wars and are more concerned about policy?
The bells toll for the Morrison government.
The contest over the cost of living has sharpened, with Anthony Albanese taking the unusual step of backing a big rise in the minimum wage.
Chloe, we're back in Sydney.
We live here now.
We do live here now. Anthony Albanese starts the day on Radio National with Patricia Karvelas. He's asked a pretty straightforward question. The ACTU is looking for a minimum wage rise of 5.5%. Will you back that in?
Well, one of the things I do support is people not going backwards, Patricia. People are doing it really tough.
It's a pretty normal response for a politician to give, nothing controversial.
It's technically not, but you can tell that we were all pretty interested because he has been skirting the details. But, you know, this is a firm number that the ACTU is put forward, and we did want to know, did he back that in? And he just wouldn't say either way.
You know, an hour or so later when he's giving a press conference and he's asked, you don't want people to go backwards. Does that mean you would support a wage hike of at least 5.1% just to keep up with inflation?
Absolutely.
That was such an interesting moment, and it happened so quickly as well because he hasn't given any other answer or any other detail or clarification. It actually became a headline because we went, oh, okay, so that is what you're thinking.
And that's the really interesting thing about it is, on the one hand, it is a remarkable answer to give. Political leaders don't usually tell the Fair Work Commission what to do in straight numbers. But at the same time, he'd been saying all morning, well, people shouldn't be falling behind in their wages. When inflation's at 5.1%, then that's what that means. That's where the minimum wage has to go to.
5.1% is a big number, and I think that's why we all, you know, jumped when we heard the clarification and confirmation that he does support that big number.
Anthony Albanese is a loose unit on the economy.
No Australian government or opposition has ever put a figure on the rate of the annual wage increase.
If you were a worker out there and you're hearing Anthony Albanese saying you should get a 5.1% pay rise, if that's all you hear, surely that is a good argument that Labor wants out there with voters. Who cares how it's going to be paid for?
This is a classic case of it's the vibe of the thing. Anthony Albanese wants to be seen as being on the side of the worker. Everyone would want a pay rise, but it's in the intricacies and details that Anthony Albanese does not want to get hung up on. But the problem for the government here is in arguing against Albanese, it has to effectively argue that workers should be going backwards, including the lowest paid workers in Australia.
Yeah, it was clear being on the campaign with the Labor side that they would want a fight on wages in this campaign.
If you get into the weeds of numbers, it gets tricky because 5.1% is not the inflation rate that the Fair Work Commission will be looking at for next year.
But I don't know how much people
care.
They don't care.
Real people out there, they just want that pay rise.
But what we do know is that unions want 5.5%. Businesses said 3. 3 is actually the highest the Chamber of Commerce and Industry has ever put in its submission for workers' pay rises. So you know, between those extremes, it's going to be somewhere in the 4s, which isn't too far from what Anthony Albanese found himself supporting.
And it's a situation where Labor finds itself saying, yes, we will write to the Fair Work Commission to make a submission.
But they won't put the number in.
Right, and so and the defence to that is, oh no, the Fair Work Commission knows what our vibe is on this. Well, what's the point in making a submission at all if the Fair Work Commission knows what your vibe is.
It doesn't want to set up a precedent that would have to follow should it win government and have to do this again next year, because the danger is of expectation.
The Nationals are defending 16 lower house seats in this election. Is Barnaby Joyce resonating in Australia?
Do you mind if I hand you one of those?
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that.
Patrick, you work with the ABC here in Tamworth. Tell us how the 22 federal elections shaping up.
Well, Barnaby Joyce still as visible as he always is in the seat of New England.
Thank you very much for helping.
Yeah, good to see you.
Really appreciate that.
There's been much made about Barnaby Joyce in the inner city urban electorates, the so-called teal independents saying a vote for a Lib is a vote for Barnaby Joyce. What do people here make about that?
I don't think it really registers too much. They judge Barnaby Joyce on his merits, and he's been re-elected 3 times now, so they've clearly got a pretty favourable view.
And do you think that the people in this part of the world appreciate having the leader of the Nationals as their local candidate?
It's certainly the feedback we got when he was returned to that position last year. They were pretty pleased that they'd have him back and thought that some of what happened to him and the way he had to resign wasn't very fair.
Just down the street from us here, the pub, there's a sign saying we're better off sticking with Barnaby, I think is the message. Is that what a lot of people here in New England would think?
More or less, I'd say, Kath. There's not a huge appetite for change in these kind of seats, but we have seen a lot of people move to these areas, and maybe they've brought their politics with them from the inner cities.
Just a week out from the election, with polls suggesting a change of government could be on the cards.
It seems the coalition's popularity is slipping. Can Scott Morrison turn things around?
The Prime Minister has made a rare concession.
I know Australians know that I can be a bit of a bulldozer when it comes to issues, and I suspect you guys know that too.
A bulldozer knocks things over. I'm a builder. That's what I am.
Scott Morrison has had this strategy of it's better to stick with the devil that you know, and now suddenly, just 8 days out from polling, he is reinventing himself.
This is one of the 4 big moments of the campaign. We've had the Albo gaffe, we've had the Solomon's crisis, we've had interest rates go up and Philip Lowe, and now we've got Scott Morrison reinventing himself. For ages he's been saying, you might not like me, but at least you know me, unlike the other guy. Now he's saying, you might not like me, but guess what? I'm going to change.
I know there are things that are going to have to change with the way I do things.
That's what he's saying, vote for me and I'll change. Well, if you want change, change the government.
We put billions every bloody year into the Australian economy, but we end up with a hospital with no doctors. How can that be?
And what happens to a town like Dingo if coal mines start shutting down?
Well, it'll shut down.
When you're talking about a community, this is people's livelihoods and their family.
So if tomorrow the mine turns off, what's your skill you're going to fall back on?
I'm on a road trip through the guts of central Queensland. This is cattle, coal and cane country.
Last federal election, a lot of people up here voted for minor parties, which helped the coalition defeat Labor. It was a shock to many in the south. So over the next week, I want to spend time talking to lots of different people. I want to know what they really care about. Are they still annoyed at the major parties? And what might change their vote next time round? About 800 people live in Taroom, which is about 5 hours northwest of Brisbane. The area is known for cattle production, but there's also cropping and timber industries that feed the local economy. It's also the only stop on this trip where I actually know a few people to call in on.
G'day Andrea, how's it going?
Afternoon,
Good?
how you going?
How you been keeping?
Keeping busy, thank you.
Always busy here it seems.
Yes.
I had to wait my turn before.
Yes.
Andrea was born and raised here and is an enthusiastic advocate for the community.
It's what you usually call the old school friendly. People help each other out, support local.
One of the biggest problems in Taroom at the moment is finding good people to fill jobs.
We have some great jobs going. Like pretty much you throw a rock anywhere, any business is looking for someone for employment to come work here. So we're having a really big problem getting people to work here.
In the media recently, we've all been talking a lot about net zero and that sort of thing. I mean, are those conversations people out here care about?
They probably are, but they haven't been talking to us about it in the butcher shop.
When it comes to federal politics, she says some people have switched off.
So I think they feel that they're forgetting about the country people and more just worrying about what the city people want, and they felt a bit unheard and left out, hence why they were going more to the minority parties where they felt that they looked after more of their issues.
If I was a politician wanting to get your vote, what would I need to do for you?
That's a good question. Probably listen to the people that actually out in the country and some of the things that they've been giving feedback, and actually not just say you're going to do it, but actually follow through.
Sounds reasonable enough. So to give me a bit of a history on politics in the area, I want to introduce you to a bloke who, in his own words, has been around a few days and is full of his own opinions.
Good to see you.
Rob Phipps is a former horse trainer, council water officer, and has only recently retired as Taroom's last locally based funeral director. And on federal politics, he doesn't take much prompting to share one of those opinions.
There are a lot of fools for a start. In the last couple of elections, said the wrong things, went the wrong way about it.
Fools as in the political leaders?
In the
fools?
political leaders, yeah. And
on both sides, you reckon?
There was, yeah, that's both sides of them.
Do you think, more broadly speaking, the national government of Australia has done enough for regional Australia?
No. You, unless you're within sight of the city lights, you're a long way from anywhere.
Taroom is in the seat of Flynn, and the Liberal National Party have held it since 2010. But when Rob was younger, a lot of people around here voted Labor.
We'd have speakers come over and speak in the main streets in the back of a truck, some very smart men. And I found they were talking to some very smart men here too, that were ringers or ring barkers or what have you. You don't get the good deep discussions now. Getting people to think ahead of what today's life is and not but great-grandfathers. Great-grandfather and grandmothers, their parents voted to Jimmy Smith because he was a leading Labor Party man of the country. The rest of them, they Joe Bill Bloggs because he was the National Party. And that was, they handed that down through the generations. They didn't give a bugger if you come with a better ideas and better things than what any other party had been for 20 years. They still voted for that one. And there's a lot of that still in the country.
I could have stayed all afternoon talking to Rob and Myra, but there was a storm coming, and we were trying to get to Gladstone by dark. The city of Gladstone is surrounded by heavy industry. Within line of sight, there's a power station, a coal port, and an aluminium smelter in the distance.
When I came home on holidays, I said, "Mum, do you know there's a power station right there?" And she's like, "Yeah, you can see it from our house." So all of this sort of, world-leading infrastructure really was just blended into the background, really normalised for me.
Jacqueline McCosker grew up here. After living away, she's moved back, now working as a climate and energy campaigner with the Australian Conservation Foundation.
Everyone wants more progressive climate action. Everyone believes in climate change. We all want to see climate solutions. But then there's a huge question mark and a very justifiable nervousness around what that means, because most of the jobs here are in heavy industry.
But as big businesses commit to big cuts to emissions, the future of Gladstone's economy is set to be transformed.
Rio Tinto is actually the biggest employer in Gladstone, and they've just announced that they will reduce their emissions 50% by 2030, and that actually means they will transition the Boyne smelter, the 2 refineries in town, so we are seeing it underway.
But where does that leave communities in the west? Places like Moranbah, which supply coal to the Gladstone port.
Something I would say to a town like Moranbah is, I'm sorry if you feel like no one has been speaking to you about the solutions so far. I don't feel like there's an excuse for coal regions to feel like they might be abandoned by any level of government. I think there are a lot of solutions that can be discussed with them. Mining, for example, is not something that's going anywhere. There's a lot of mining that needs to happen for green energy and green manufacturing, and that's not changing. But there is going to be an adjustment, and there will be, some mines are probably going to close, and there is going to be a level of adaptation. But we're pretty adaptive people.
I mean, like if they're going to zero, no coal, no this, what's the reason the glassing to be, why would we exist?
Despite hosting many multi-billion-dollar resource companies, retired Gladstone labourer Robert Melvin worries there'll be nothing to show for it.
We put billions every bloody year into the Australian economy, but we end up with a hospital with no doctors. How can that be?
The major federal political parties are still not very popular up here.
Well, nobody seems to do anything. I mean, it's like banging your head against a bloody wall, mate. It feels good when you stop. You just hope to Christ, mate, you just jump at anything, eh? And that's Pauline and mate and that other fella, mate, from Townsville. And sometimes they actually do get things done. I mean, like Pauline has a few things she got done. I mean, I reckon she's a total bloody idiot, but that's my personal opinion. But she does do things, man. She's doing it with the best intentions.
An hour's drive north of Gladstone, and you're in the beef capital of Australia. There's a bit more than beef in Rockhampton though. With 120,000 people in the region, it's a major service centre, not just for the mining industry, but also agriculture and health. At the Frenchville Cricket Club, third grade are just finishing a session in the nets. Captain Lachlan Smith is close to graduating as an engineer and hopes to find work in the region.
So are you worried about the future of some of the industries that engineers have traditionally worked in around here?
I mean, like railway will be, a big industry for many years to come. Like mining, will eventually close down, but we've still got plenty of time ahead of us to, get jobs for the next 30, 40, 50 years.
What do I have to do to get your vote? What's important to you?
Just be honest. Be down to earth and honest. If you can back up what you're saying that you're going to put forward to the table, you get my vote. That's generally how I, pick my numbers. There's a lot of political campaigns. I don't really want to get into it too deeply, but a lot of people bring their little piece of paper out and they say what they're going to do and whatnot, and then they don't back up on it. If you're able to, talk the talk and then walk the walk, you'll get my vote.
The old racecourse over here has been there for hundreds of years, racecourse.
This is Durranville country, and when it comes to national politics, Elder Uncle George James feels like things have stagnated.
I think with our politics here, we've come to a bit of a standstill. We've got to rev it up, put it in top gear. We've got to move along a little bit.
He'd like to see federal leaders do more than just fly in and fly out for Beef Week.
We can go to our local fellow and say, oh, this is this and this, but we've got to have the big ones here. We've got to have the top ones here because they fly over us.
Last election, a lot of people in the seat of Capricornia voted for Pauline Hanson's party. Uncle George is philosophical about it. He says even some of his own mob voted for One Nation.
And I know some of our people went there, like you say, frustration. Frustration maybe from other parties or maybe nobody else wanted to talk to them. But I think everybody's entitled to have their say. But like I say, you fix that at the voting boxes.
And his message to Parliament is simple.
Honesty and cooperation would be the main key for me. Yeah.
And that's been missing a bit, you reckon?
I think so, yeah.
A few hours west of Gladstone is the town of Dingo. The biggest employer is the sawmill. It cuts timber props for underground coal mines. Almost everyone living here is connected to the coal industry. Lance Olive is one of them. He's a timber cutter and his family have lived in Dingo for generations. He senses an uncertainty about the town's future.
No one sort of talks about it, they don't. Yeah.
Are you thinking, oh, I'll be right, but I don't know about my next generation?
That's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, I'll be right, because they're going to shut it down by when? Well, one lot's saying 2050 and someone else was saying 2030, so, you know, yeah, the next generation's going to find it tough, aren't they?
And what happens to a town like Dingo if coal mines start shutting down?
Well, it'll shut down. It'll be a ghost town, that's what'll happen. And that's what I can't understand. They're letting new coal mines open up, but they say they want to ban it.
So you want to see a plan?
Yeah, a plan put in place, yeah.
In decades gone, Lance remembers local MPs stopping in Dingo for a beer, but it feels like a long time between drinks.
There's just no touch at all with the people. They don't see them, they don't talk to them. I reckon you'll see more of them going for the likes of One Nation and United Party.
Further west is the town of Emerald. It's a major centre with over 12,000 people. It's traditionally serviced a productive agricultural region, but in recent decades, mining has become a major economic driver. The mines are one of the biggest clients at Kaya Tebbett's office supply shop, but there is uncertainty in the air here too. The government is committed to net zero, but says coal is going to have a great future.
They're just confused. There's no consistent, are we doing this? Are we not doing this? There's no, we're just not sure what to do, what our next move is.
Right now, Kaya's biggest concerns are basic health services that many in the city might take for granted.
I would like medical facilities ramped up. I want to be able to, if people are suffering from terminal illnesses, to be able to stay with their families here. I want the opportunity for people to have their babies here. I want to be able to go to our local hospital and them be able to help us, not send us off.
Last financial year, the Central Highlands region generated over $10 billion of output.
The companies that are providing all of that money are here, but they fly everyone back to these big cities, and that's all well and good, but we still need to provide for the people that are here, that are, you know, the backbone of these little towns, and the railway and the hospitals and the councils and things like that.
Anglican Minister Jen Hurcott echoes Kaya's concerns about services. And she's also noticed a darker side to a community where many work long shifts.
Just hope. They seem to lack hope in that situation. The fatigue levels are something that is just draining them out. So, yes, there would be some families that are suffering frustration, but I see a profound sadness in disconnection. Yeah.
What's lacking, she says, is a meaningful, big picture plan.
I think transition, so long-term planning, so more than one election cycle in planning, looking 20 to 30 years down the track. As our town transitions, how do they maintain the community, and how do they maintain the services that are here? Making sure that we continue to have a town that meets the needs of the whole region.
Jen reckons there needs to be better engagement from all levels of government.
Part of this is about engaging who we are as a town and seeing that we're more than one thing. And actually planting seeds of hope for the future based on who we are and what we can be.
This is the heart of the Bowen Basin, Australia's largest coal reserve. There are about 44 mines operating over 60,000 square kilometres. But most of the coal mined here is metallurgical coal, which is used to make steel. For now, it's unviable to produce steel without it. Over 8,000 people live in Moranbah, the biggest town in the Bowen Basin. It was purpose-built by mining companies, and for nearly 40 years, it's been home for Carol and Fritz.
Oh, look, we're predominantly mining, but we're so much more than that.
Recently, it's been hard to hear people who have never been to Moranbah call for the shutdown of an industry that has given so many a great life.
This is people's livelihoods, and we're families, we're real people. So when you want to shut down our major industry, you're talking about families. We went through a boom and a crazy time there where houses were getting sold for $1 million out here.
Really?
Why would you do that? I don't know, but they bought them for $800 to $1 million as an investment, and then we're just coming out the other side now. But there was probably 3 mortgagee auctions a day.
Carolyn knows what can happen here when the market for coal changes.
This is the camp that's shut down. It used to be a thriving camp. Like, we used to go to their canteen and have dinner.
Over the past couple of days, we've met a lot of people who have refused to talk to us on the record. In places like Moranbah, people are worried that what they say could jeopardise their job or their place in the community. And from what I can gather, it's because everyone here knows that fortunes can change quickly. Take this place, for example. Hundreds of people used to live in this BHP mining accommodation. Today, it's abandoned. Is the federal government or state government involved enough at the moment talking to you about the future, or has it sort of been left to the locals?
I think it's been left to the locals.
And you think the mining companies won't leave you high and dry, that they've got plans in place for the future? You trust them for now?
Yes, at the moment, yes, that's exactly what they're doing. You know, they have end of life for their mine sites, and it might be in 40 years' time, but they're already engaging with the community and community leaders on what it is that we'd like to see happen to those mine sites once they have to close them down. This town was built because of the mine.
So if they shut it down, Moranbah's gone. Do you think we can do something else? Because look at all these great facilities out here. I mean, it'd be a shame to bulldoze it.
I think if the mines closed down, the town would shrink. It will only be the hardcore people who stay behind, if they can. It's a hard question to predict, but I would say that Moranbah would be severely hurt by it.
Is there any modelling or discussions in those boardrooms that you sit in that's being discussed? Yeah. That's a hard conversation to have.
Yeah, it is. It's very hard.
For now, until the hydrogen industry ramps up and green steel becomes a reality, trains will keep rolling into Hay Point Coal Terminal near Mackay. But when all this coal is burnt, the CO2 it releases will keep driving global warming. The urgency of the problem has driven career coal miner Grant Howard to campaign for change.
I don't want to shut the industry down, nobody does. What we want is a transition, and I want coal miners to understand that transition, be a part of that conversation.
So why didn't you quit?
I thought about that. In fact, I went to work and people were saying, you shouldn't be a coal miner, you're a hypocrite, you're this, you're that.
Was everyone like that? A bit pissed off at you?
No, not everyone. It's difficult to gauge. Definitely people confronted me with it, like physically.
What did that look like in the crib room? You're getting people.
It's difficult because these guys are, for every other reason, they're great guys. I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for other mine workers looking after me. And as an older mine worker, I feel compelled to look after them. The bottom line is they need the truth. They need good information, and that's all I wanted to do.
The coal mining industry has given people such a high quality of life. There's people driving around brand new Dodge Rams, and people own multiple properties on the coast or wherever. Like it's a good life. You get a good income. What comes next probably won't be like that, right? Is that the hard thing to swallow?
Indeed, it is, and it's probably a conversation that people don't like to have. And in me, sort of trying to understand, that inertia and that reluctance and that rejection of this whole idea that things are changing. Perhaps that is part of the problem, that in the industry, those coal miners You know, it's not a secret. Yeah, they do. They do earn a good living and they deserve it. They're working under 500 metres underground, 12 hours a day. It's hot, it's dusty, it's noisy, it's monotonous. You know, I don't think anyone would take that away from them. But the difficulty then becomes is they've set their lives up. They're a part of that affluence. And so what does come after that? And
what does come after that?
And that's a good question.
Grant still works in the coal industry. He's built a life and a career around it. But he's also someone who cares deeply about the environment. The relationship between these two parts of him is complex.
I'm a coal miner, and at times, you know, I just couldn't articulate how I'd reconcile all this. And so where I eventually got to, and it took a while, was that we were all equally responsible. You know, we dig up coal and we make stuff, and everyone uses that stuff. So at the end of the day, we're all equally responsible.
The coal industry remains a big economic driver in the Mackay region. However, the area is also known as Australia's sugarcane capital. It's an industry that Marion Healy's South Sea Islander community helped to build.
As recently as the 80s, mining wasn't really a big deal.
No. I can remember I finished high school in 1980, and you know my brother at the time was one of the first in our families to go into the trade of industry. He was a blacksmith. Moranbah was just only opening up at that time, so yeah, it was just sugarcane. My dad worked in the sugar fields for many generations and years, so we were a sugar town. Yeah.
And how has mining changed this place?
How's it changed it? It's fathers away from their children. Mothers are now away from their children because women are being enticed to come out and work on the big trucks. A lot of my mates that I catch up with, I have to work around their shifts. You know, so the girls back in town, so we go out when they get home. You'll see a lot of our young kids are dysfunctional in their families, whether they're black or white, you know. Other people are raising their children for them because the mums and dads are working out in the mining towns.
When coal mining does eventually wind down, the cane industry will still be a place you can get a job, but the money won't be as good.
Does this town have to get ready to take a pay cut?
Yeah, oh, definitely. And I think they need to be skilled in other things. So if tomorrow the mine turns off, what's your skill you're going to fall back on? Look at the Australian South Sea.
While I had her ear, I also wanted to get Marion's take on the recent popularity of minor parties like One Nation.
I don't think they're hearing us, The little, you know, I consider myself to be a regional person, but are they really, really taking notice of me down south with our two major parties? If I can talk about the young lad that's here who is One Nation, he so happens to be Australian South Sea Islander, Stephen Andrews.
Really? He's one of your crew?
Yeah, one of my crews, yeah. He's one of our mob, yeah.
And he's running for One Nation?
Yeah, even though the values are very, you know, it's like in your face. And I'll say to Steve, I spent time with Steve last week, you know. He came and supported me at the Kanaka Proud Cup. He's a strong South Sea Island man. We know that he's jumped on board with a party that's either given him weight to have his say and so on, and I don't agree with the values that Pauline Henson up there and promoting. But young Steve, you know, he listens, he will listen. He's working strongly to put a bill through at the moment to make them start sitting up and start challenging them.
Across all the towns and cities we visited in central Queensland, this has been a consistent message. People feel forgotten by political leaders. They want to be listened to and they want to be engaged with, genuinely.
If we're talking to someone, we've got to get trust in that person.
There is uncertainty around the future of coal mining, one of the biggest employers in the region, and
no one sort of talks about it, you know. Yeah.
To many, politicians don't seem ready to have hard conversations.
I don't feel like there's an excuse for coal regions to feel like they might be abandoned.
Many places we drove through aren't what they once were. Not as many people work in agriculture like they used to. Most jobs are in the city. And even when there are jobs in the bush, there aren't the people to fill them. Is that because that even in major regional centres, people have to live with compromised basic services?
They don't fly home and get sick.
Having to leave town for treatments, that's not good enough.
Central Queenslanders are more complex than the stereotypes given to them by some southerners.
I think they think we're all cowboys.
They work hard and they love where they live.
It's better growing up in a little town than a city.
And with so much distrust and uncertainty, how they vote this election is anyone's guess.
We're just Queenslanders, mate. We're stubborn, mob, eh? Yeah.
Tonight, wages return to the centre of the election contest, with new figures showing they're growing at half the rate of inflation. New South Wales announces another inquiry into a mother's conviction over the deaths of her 4 children. Uncertainty surrounds the fate of Ukrainian fighters evacuated from a steelworks plant in Mariupol. And Shayna Jack caps off a stunning return to the pool at the Australian Swimming Championships. Good evening, Yvonne Yong with ABC News. Just 3 days out from the election, the cost of living has again dominated campaigning. Data shows wages are growing with an annual rise of 2.4%, but that's less than half the rate of inflation. Labor leader Anthony Albanese is blaming the government for bad economic management. The Prime Minister argues soaring inflation is a global challenge.
When sure-footed defence fails, when stamina runs down, break out the bulldozer and flatten all before you. All over the pitch and all at odds with a campaign built around easing pain.
Here we go.
His opponent proving hits can come without laying a finger.
The biggest cuts to real wages in more than 20 years.
We're seeing those wages start to rise again, but the challenge is inflation.
The latest wage figures showing pay packets increased by 0.7% in the March quarter and 2.4% over the year, less than half the 5.1% rise in the cost of living over the same period.
Australian workers are paying the price for a decade of bad policy and economic failures.
Scott Morrison pointing to the war in Europe to explain painfully high inflation.
It's one of the biggest shocks to the global economy, if not the biggest we've seen since the 1970s.
Economic management the focus for the final week of the election campaign. With Labor not releasing its costings until tomorrow, the coalition's decided to get in early.
Altogether, the Labor Party have racked up some $440 billion in additional spending pressures.
And exactly what did he count to conjure a figure so big?
Through nods and winks to the states and territories.
No one there to nod or wink in agreement.
The only way to change Australia for the better is to change the government this Saturday.
He does seem to be getting a bit ahead of himself. And, Australians will make this decision, Anthony. You don't get to make it before the election.
In a nod to budget repair, Anthony Albanese revealed a couple of savings today worth $750 million. But that's not the whole picture. Labor's costings will likely show higher deficits than the coalition alternative. The ALP will argue its spending will boost productivity, judging that when the nation already has $1 trillion IOU, tackling debt might not be the pressing issue it once was. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
For workers faced with a rising cost of living, wages can't go up fast enough. But for now, the only sure thing on the cards is another rate hike.
After working as a chef for 2 decades, Scott Bowerman started a labour hire business. He says many workers in hospitality still don't get paid above the minimum wage.
I've been in the industry for 20 years and it hasn't changed. It's stuck in the early 80s.
The annual wage growth was weighed down by sluggish rises in the public sector. The only industry that saw an annual pay rise above 3% was real estate. It means pay packets are rising well below the average level of 3.1%.
This is the largest real wage fall that we've seen in many years, and it's likely to get worse before it gets better.
Consumer prices are increasing more than twice the pace of wages and have been growing faster than pay packets for the past year. For many employers across Australia, staff only make up about 25% of business costs, although it is higher in some sectors like hospitality. But across industries, a 5% pay rise to keep up with the cost of living isn't likely to push prices up by the same amount. But inflation will continue to be a problem, which means another rate hike next month.
We think it's more likely we'll see another 25 basis point hike because the RBA is still quite focused on seeing wage growth accelerate.
And in some industries, it is already. Bonnie Kalapouris is willing to pay more to attract staff to work at her dental practice.
Yeah, to get that staff, you do sort of need to match those rates if you do want to get access to that small pool that's available.
As the cost of living continues to rise, workers are counting the pay offers will eventually catch up. Nasim Khadem, ABC News.
New South Wales has announced a new public inquiry into the conviction of Kathleen Folbig over the deaths of her 4 children. Folbig remains behind bars over the murder of 3 children and the manslaughter of a 4th. Various court appeals since then have failed, and an inquiry in 2019 reinforced her guilt. The Attorney-General says another inquiry is needed to examine new scientific evidence suggesting a genetic mutation could be responsible for the deaths of 2 of the children.
That doesn't mean that I formed any view as to the guilt or innocence of Ms Folbig, nor as to whether there is any reasonable doubt about her conviction. But certainly there is enough of a question or doubt that this new scientific evidence raises that justifies some form of intervention.
But he resisted calls from Folbig's lawyers for a pardon, saying that was inappropriate. Western Australia has recorded more than 16,000 new COVID cases today. The numbers are making vulnerable communities anxious, particularly since the relaxation of mask rules.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, that's lovely. Thank you.
For some, morning tea is the only time in public they take their masks off.
We always wear our masks.
Yeah, I think we're going to wear ours for a while yet.
Yeah.
Mm.
I'll walk in the streets without a mask, but I certainly wouldn't with all these people around.
Since the mask mandate was lifted, leaving the house is a source of anxiety for some older West Australians. At this event at the Perth Town Hall, crowds have almost halved.
It's, I don't know, it's just that uncertain time. So we haven't really got back to normal as yet. Sometimes families encourage them not to come because they're more likely to catch it.
Come on, we can put you in now. It's not just the CBD which seniors are avoiding. This entire gymnasium used to be full of carpet bowlers.
I'd hate for any of my people to come down with COVID because I've taken them out bowling.
While some vulnerable people are choosing to stay home because of the risks, others are still choosing to go out.
You'll see a lot of people here today wearing their masks, but they also know that the secret of life is getting out and having a go.
We can't believe it.
Christine Allen's mother is one of those who thinks it's not a risk worth taking.
She feels that she may not survive if she gets COVID.
She implores people to consider the vulnerable when making decisions about masks and other measures.
I don't know that it should be mandated that we all wear them, but certainly think of people who are at higher risk than you are.
A nervous time for many, with case numbers expected to continue climbing. Case in Ho, ABC News.
The fate of hundreds of Ukrainian fighters evacuated from a steel plant in Mariupol remains unclear after they surrendered to Russian forces. Several more buses carrying soldiers from the factory have been driven to Russian-controlled territory. The severely wounded are being treated in hospital, while others have been sent to a penal colony near Donetsk. The soldiers fought for almost 3 months in what became a symbol of Ukrainian resistance. More than 260 troops are now in Russian hands, with some yet to be evacuated. Ukraine's hoping they'll be part of a prisoner swap. North Korea has sent in the army to lead its response to a COVID outbreak as the virus sweeps through its unvaccinated population. But offers of outside help are still being ignored.
As fever cases sweep across the country, state television reveals a confident commander-in-chief leading the way. Presiding over a Politburo meeting, cigarette in hand, Kim Jong-un accused his officials of being inadequate and slammed their response to the first confirmed COVID-19 outbreak as immature. There's speculation this parade, marking 90 years of the country's military, was a super spreader event. Huge crowds, unmasked and not socially distanced. Soon after, the nation's non-existent vaccine program and severe lack of medical supplies were exposed.
We lacked awareness and understanding of the disease and did not know how to treat it.
It's impossible to pin down the extent of the outbreak in the secretive nation. North Korea has confirmed more than 1.7 million cases of fever, but it says the virus situation is taking a favourable turn. The armed forces have been mobilised, and according to state media, treatments ranging from painkillers to home remedies are working.
We were sick, but every night and morning I made us gargle with salt water.
It's what's not being shown that has experts worried.
You need antivirals. They don't have that. I'm certain of it. It's a matter of incredible urgency that we get the pills to them as soon as possible.
But offers of vaccines are being met with silence.
The regime is probably worried about the optics of it, the optics that the regime is not capable enough.
It's just terrible, you know, there's 26 million people who are already living under one of the harshest regimes in the world, and now they're facing this terrible health situation on top.
North Korea is desperately poor, with almost half the population undernourished. The United Nations has warned that locking down the country would have dire consequences for those already struggling to feed their families. James Oaten, ABC News.
Australia's wool producers are attempting to cut the thousands of tonnes of carbon emissions they generate every year. One of the big contributors to that is transport. So some Tasmanian producers have hopped on board a novel way of taking wool to market.
An unusual journey for precious cargo.
It's one of those things when it's suggested, you sort of think, OK, I'll go with that.
These bales of low methane merino wool have been pedalled hundreds of kilometres from Tasmania's northern Midlands to Hobart and will travel hundreds more to Geelong on board this sailboat. It's a one-off exercise by a fashion brand to see how close they can get to zero carbon wool.
It's an extreme example that makes us think. And through the thinking process, perhaps we can make little steps which will lead to big steps to improve things throughout the whole supply chain.
Australia provides a quarter of the world's wool. The industry is worth $3.4 billion. Consumers are demanding a more sustainable product, and part of that comes down to transportation.
It is the most significant contributor to emissions from a manufacturing point of view. But again, the important thing to note is that is a very small fraction of time in the life cycle of a woolen garment.
While carbon emissions are front of mind for many producers, it's not the only piece of the environmental puzzle. Some farmers are looking to other, less quantifiable factors.
It is absolutely critical in wool and across all industries that we have lower greenhouse gas emissions. While it is a really critical part of the story, it's not the only factor. So we also made to make sure that we're looking at other things such as biodiversity.
Colette Glazik and her family are planting thousands of shrubs on their sheep property annually.
We want to provide habitat for both insects, birds and other mammals.
From farm to arm with the smallest possible footprint. Erin Cooper, ABC News.
Briefly to sport now, an Australian swimmer, Shayna Jack, has placed second in the women's 100-metre freestyle event at the Australian Swimming Championships in Adelaide. Her second spot guarantees her selection for the Australian team for the World Championships and Commonwealth Games later this year. It's the first time she's made an Australian team since she ended her 2-year ban for taking a prohibited drug. The race was won by Molly O'Callaghan, who set the fastest time in the world this year. And for a look at the weather, here's Paul Higgins.
Well, tomorrow the rain that's been falling over Western Australia into South Australia will weaken out, and gusty winds and showers in the southeast will also ease as the high moves further east and ridges in. But that high is going to increase onshore winds over the Queensland coast, and together with an approaching upper level trough, it'll cause some showers to ramp up there, especially Friday and Saturday. Thursday in Perth and in Brisbane there'll be a shower or two, and in Melbourne just a chance of a shower on a partly cloudy day. Sydney will have blue skies. In Canberra, a frosty -1 degree start to your day. In Hobart, a possible shower. Adelaide will be mostly sunny, and sunny in Darwin.
That's the latest from ABC News. I'm Yvonne Yong. Have a good evening.
Welcome to the program. Scientists warn climate change means that when it comes to natural disasters, unprecedented is the new normal. Governments and emergency services have faced a series of massive disasters recently, from floods to fires. Now former insiders are speaking out, claiming a lack of investment in the kind of long-term modelling Australia needs to adapt to a more volatile climate. This story by National Environment reporter Michael Slezak and producer Penny Timms.
I bought the place at the end of 2016 and I knew it was in a flood zone. I'm a low-income earner and my choices were limited in terms of affordable housing in Lismore.
In 2017, Lismore was inundated by an 11.6 metre flood, the worst in more than 40 years. Almost a foot of water went through Jo Grove's home. After that, she received a grant to help elevate her property well above a 1 in 100 year flood event. It's now 4 metres off the ground.
I believed that raising the house would make it flood safe. We raised it to that level because that was the maximum level that we were legally allowed to go at the time.
But this February, an even higher flood devastated Lismore, topping the level of the worst-case scenario predicted just once every 100 years.
I had 1.25 metres of water through my home. I was insured for the 2017 flood, but after that the premiums were so high that they were unaffordable. So I have no flood insurance.
There's a little moment of joy, hey?
Around the country, houses are built to avoid a flood that's expected, on average, once a century. That guide is built into the planning rules of state governments and local councils.
It's a statistical model to help risk planners who are responsible for where people live, how their homes are constructed.
Greg Mullins used to be the boss of New South Wales Fire and Rescue, as well as the association that represents all emergency services in Australia.
And in reality, as we saw recently in Brisbane and Lismore, you might get 3 in 3 weeks.
Floods that go beyond the 1 in 100 year level, like the one that occurred this year in Lismore, have been considered rare enough that for some types of infrastructure, it's a risk that's okay to take. But climate scientists say those calculated risks are no longer accurate.
It's actually a 1 in 100 year event.
This is a natural disaster of unprecedented proportions.
This is an unprecedented event.
We keep getting told these events are like unprecedented, once in a lifetime, but they seem to happen with alarming regularity.
Climate scientists have been providing these sorts of warnings about the increasing impact of climate extremes for more than 2 decades.
David Caroli was until this year head of the Climate Science Centre at the National Science Agency, the CSIRO. He says we need to work out how frequently such disasters return.
Those return periods are essentially worthless now because we know that the return periods, for instance, for extreme rainfall or flooding, is based on out-of-date historical data.
We're flying blind. We don't know what to expect.
Experts say a major investment is needed in the type of tools that could help avoid the catastrophe that occurred here in Kinglake more than a decade ago. On the 8th of February 2009, a fire roared into the forests here. Flames reached more than 30 metres into the air. The Forest Fire Danger Index was literally off the charts. The fire weather so extreme, a new category of danger had to be created. It took weeks for the fires to be put out. 120 people lost their lives in this area alone.
The Black Saturday bushfires were made significantly worse by climate change.
The Royal Commission into the wildfires which caused devastation from Queensland to Victoria in the summer of 2020 recommended the Commonwealth, state and territory governments work together to fix the knowledge gap, producing tools called downscaled climate projections that better predict what sorts of disasters to expect in the future and where.
Topographic influences, coastal influences, extreme rainfall events all require high spatial resolution information. We can only get that using downscaling that takes the global scale information down to the local scale.
To get those projections, existing climate models need to be run at greater resolution than has previously been done. That takes a lot of time on supercomputers, and that will cost tens of millions of dollars. In 2014, the Productivity Commission estimated that 97% of disaster funding goes into recovery, with only 3% going into mitigating those disasters.
It's a recipe for disaster, quite literally a disaster.
Robert Glasser used to be the United Nations Special Representative for Disaster Risk Reduction and now works at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute.
These disasters are estimated to increase in cost to something like 39 billion, even without climate change. With climate change, it'll be far more. And that's pretty much what Australia spends currently on our entire defence budget.
The lack of knowledge about likely extreme weather is also pushing up insurance costs around the country.
There are some properties that are now becoming uninsurable.
In the wake of the Black Summer bushfires, the Morrison government set up a virtual agency that appeared to satisfy the Royal Commission's recommendation to produce downscaled climate projections.
It has seen us invest $209 million to establish the Australian Climate Service to help us better anticipate, manage and adapt to the impacts of natural disasters and climate change.
But the Royal Commission was clear. It should be a collaboration between the federal government and the states.
So we only had 30 years of records up to that period.
Professor Caroli's work at the CSIRO helped shape the Royal Commission's recommendation.
The states need to be involved right at every stage in the planning of future climate projections and the understanding of the impacts, because the states are where all of the, if you like, emergency management activity happens.
But when the Australian Climate Service was set up, it was made answerable to two agencies, both of which report to the Commonwealth's Department of Home Affairs.
During the bushfires, Scott Morrison justified his trip to Hawaii at the height of the fires by saying, it's a state and territory responsibility, not my job. Well, my job's to try and work out what's happening with these fires, and if I don't have the data, if that's held in a government department that's not responsible for doing that, what good is it?
In a written statement, a coalition spokesman said this type of work cannot be done alone and pointed out that National Cabinet has already agreed for the Australian and all state and territory governments to work together to share data and disaster risk information. That was an in-principle agreement from last year, and the government didn't clarify how or when states would get access to the data.
We need that information yesterday, not 10 years in the future.
Back at the cleanup, Joe Groves is grappling with what to do next.
I feel sorry.
And she no longer wants to grow old in her own home.
You know, this was going to be my forever home, and I can't do it again. You know, I have to go.
You can find full statements from the federal government as well as the Environment and Meteorology departments on our website. 2 published opinion polls today showed the gap between the major parties narrowing in the final days before Saturday's federal election. Today, the campaign was dominated by questions about Labor's policy costings. They're not out until tomorrow, and the release of further data showing real wages are falling. Against that backdrop, opposition leader Anthony Albanese addressed the National Press Club. Here's Chief Political Correspondent Laura Tingle.
Dr Hewson had to fight his way through anti-GST demonstrators.
I need to know exactly what type of cake to give a detailed answer.
This is the question for Dr Hewson. Is it taxable? Is it GST-able? The answer is it is.
Do you apologise for those young people who are told to go get a job?
No, I didn't say go get a job.
Oh,
someone just
somebody
get the
putting
context
words in
right.
your mouth,
No.
How are you, Mark? Good, how are you? I'm very well. Good to see you.
It's not that cold. There has been an exasperation in this election campaign with the media, and gotcha questions, and stories about gaffes. But past elections show how powerful one moment or one line can be in shaping perceptions. And if Anthony Albanese wins on Saturday, it will be despite such moments.
National unemployment rate at the moment is, I think it's 5.4, sorry. I'm not sure what it is.
We're not proposing.
I'm sorry.
The opposition leader was seen to have won all 3 of the leaders' debates.
When you've been a minister, we've had the Port of Darwin sold to a company connected with the Chinese Communist Party.
All these things make different impressions on voters. They also make impressions on the journalists reporting on elections. Less than a week ago, an opinion poll in The Australian suggesting Labor would win an 80-seat majority saw journalists travelling with the leaders framing questions about winning to the opposition leader and about losing to the Prime Minister. Today, new polls show the lead has narrowed. The election is now very tight. Expectations have changed again. All of that made today's appearance at the National Press Club all the more important for Anthony Albanese.
I'm seeking the honour of serving as Prime Minister of the best country in the world.
Today, there were 2 topics at the top of the campaign agenda: a renewed focus on falling wages, but also Labor's budget costings.
The shadow treasurer who's running around saying a couple of $1 billion here and there over a year is not much. It's not a big deal. Well, it is a big deal, Jim. It's a very big deal.
It was the issue of costings, which yesterday produced a campaign image which played large on the television. Anthony Albanese was showing walking away, or running, according to some, from a press conference where he protests he had already answered 18 questions.
Mr Albanese, will your deficit be higher or lower than the coalition?
I don't want to disappoint you for Thursday.
By this morning, the government was claiming that its estimates were that Labor's policies would cost $25 billion more than the government's over 4 years.
You have to answer eventually.
Labor is not denying that they will spend more than the government, but is arguing it is a quality spend rather than spending on pork barrelling.
We've got $1 trillion in debt. And so the Australian people aren't focused on press conferences or the timing of costings release. They're focused on whether or not they can feed their kids under Scott Morrison.
Labor argues the late release of costings is just what the Coalition did in 2010 and 2013. But this sits uncomfortably with its pledge for better standards and accountability.
We have released with every single policy we've released how much it would cost over the forward estimates.
The government announced yesterday that it would save $1 billion by imposing constraints on public service spending. Today, the opposition leader announced $750 million of savings from putting some of the funds that the government distributes to target electorates back into the budget, where it says it can be better spent on delivering services, and that there would be more savings to come.
Yesterday, they stood up and said we're going to gut the public service even more. Well, you know what that leads to? Robo-debt. It doesn't save money, it costs money because you take humans out of human services and it has devastating consequences for real people. It costs lives, as well as over $1 billion to taxpayers.
The other new piece of information today was about wages. The so-called wage price index rose by just 2.4% for the year, compared to 5.1% inflation, once again confirming that real wages are going backwards, one of Labor's major charges against the government.
Wages will rise for all the reasons that I've said. Wages will rise because of unemployment coming down.
A fall of 2.7%. What a hit. This delivers the biggest cuts to real wages in more than 20 years.
At the beginning of the campaign, Scott Morrison said the election should not be a referendum about his government, but about a choice for the future. At its end, Anthony Albanese seems to agree.
The choice Australians have to make this Saturday is which party can be trusted to solve these problems. The Liberal government that created them, a Prime Minister who denied them and then blamed them on someone else, or a Labor Party driven by a determination to learn the lessons of the pandemic, to face up to the big challenges confronting our country and to bring people together to build a better future.
Last year, Facebook pages shut down in Australia for some hospitals, emergency services and charities during a standoff with the federal government about a proposal to make social media giants pay for news content. Facebook blamed a technical error at the time, but it's now been accused of causing the chaos deliberately. Michael Vincent reports.
A big portion of Mission Beat is to make sure that people know that there are services available when they need them, and that we care about their well-being and that we're helping them make it through what they need to get through either the winter or a cold night.
Like many charities, Mission Australia has come to rely on social media, using Facebook to help deliver services to homeless people.
Actually going onto our website, tracking down our contact number, jumping on the phone is not something that people would typically do as much as they once did. Now we're finding that it's easier for them to reach out to us on Facebook, send us a message, or let us know about their situation. Being able to hear back from our services and to know what's available can be of critical need in that time and that moment. And it's pretty important to us that we're able to respond in a timely manner.
But last year, Mission Australia was one of dozens of local charities, health groups and even emergency services whose Facebook pages were taken down overnight.
It was definitely very confusing for our team. We went to post on our Facebook page, and upon realising that it was down, we were quite distraught as a team. We were frantic in trying to figure out what had happened overnight.
When users tried to get help, there was no response.
No appeals or reporting mechanism for those websites to inform Facebook that they were taken down.
The shutdown happened in the midst of a furious debate over new social media laws, which would force social media companies to pay news organisations for their content. Facebook said the takedown was inadvertent, but now whistleblowers say it was a deliberate tactic.
Facebook, now Meta, had effectively used or held the Australian people hostage in order to get better terms legislatively for themselves. I mean, by doing the Australian shutdown, it adversely impacted not just the Australian government, but the people of Australia.
Whistleblower Aid represents former Facebook employee Frances Haugen. Along with the Wall Street Journal, it obtained documents which show an internal timeline for what Facebook has called the ideal timing for the takedown. When Facebook employees raised concerns that the company was deliberately shutting down community and charity pages, a manager replied that it was based on guidance from the policy and legal team.
You had various Facebook employees who are not witting of the Australian takedown program, if you will, who saw what was happening and were internally trying to report up the chain of command that there is a problem. And despite their best efforts to raise those concerns, those concerns were effectively ignored.
The takedowns began on February 18. Just 5 days later, the Australian government agreed to a deal with Facebook, which substantially altered the legislation, which passed the Parliament the next day.
The words to me directly from Mark Zuckerberg were that that news content will be restored to Facebook's Australian platform.
The Wall Street Journal says that as soon as the deal was done, Facebook unblocked the Australian government's page. At the time, Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg declared it had reached the best possible outcome in Australia. Its CEO, Sheryl Sandberg, praised the thoughtfulness of the strategy and precision of execution. Facebook rejects allegations its tactics were deliberate. Whistleblower Aid has provided the documents to US regulators, the US Congress and Australia's ACCC for investigation. It says now that Facebook is facing similar Australian-style regulation in Canada and Europe, the social media giant is unlikely to try similar tactics again.
I think by there being a spotlight shed on this, where everybody can see exactly what they're doing, that hopefully provides those legislators the impetus to do what they need to do.
Facebook's actions have also led charities like Mission Australia to question their reliance on the social media giant.
We have learned the hard way that Facebook is not to be our main source of communication or heavily trusted.
You can find a statement from Meta on our website. The Me Too movement and a series of high-profile sexual assault cases have caused a record number of women to seek counselling. As Hagar Cohen reports, services say they're unable to meet the huge increase in demand.
I was really outgoing, loved the beach. Academically very bright. I went to a selective school, I was very studious, I was a good girl. When I was 14, so I was in year 8 at high school, I was still a child. I was sexually assaulted on multiple occasions.
Now 42, Karen Isles says she has never recovered from this trauma.
At the time when I was raped, my whole sense of self, my whole identity were just stripped bare from me. It's unspeakable, the amount of trauma.
Karen still recalls how difficult it was to report her alleged sexual assault at the police station.
It was only when I reached adulthood that I started to feel comfortable in describing what had happened to me.
Last year, Karen obtained police documents through a Freedom of Information request and discovered that police did not pursue her allegations.
When I reported to police, I expected that they would do something. My whole sense of self, my entire identity was completely ripped apart at that time.
It was during this process that Karen decided she was finally going to get help.
I reached out to a specialist sexual assault clinic attached to the local hospital. Unfortunately, their wait list is 12 months long. I'm still on the wait list.
It's not okay. When it takes the bravery and courage to step forward, it's really important that we acknowledge that that person has a human right to access the appropriate support.
Morning. Morning, Tara. How are you?
As the former manager of a sexual assault service in Sydney, Tara Hunter says that means it can be months before help is available, and in other cases there's no help at all.
Those services are absolutely buckling under the pressure of the demand. So we've seen an exponential increase in reports of sexual assault. There are massive gaps in terms of having a responsive and accessible system.
730 has obtained exclusive access to wait lists of sexual assault services across the country. In New South Wales, the clinic at the RPA hospital in Sydney has a wait list of between 6 to 12 months. Westmead Hospital in Sydney's West currently has an 8-month wait list. In Queensland, it's a 6 to 9 month wait for the service at Toowoomba and 1.5 years for some of the counselling programs at Laurel Place in the Sunshine Coast.
And there are some black spots around Australia where there are no services at all.
My staff are working absolutely as hard as they possibly can, and they feel the burden of that wait list. They feel the guilt of that. They carry that every day.
The Allambie Centre in the Peel region of WA experienced a 40% increase in demand in the past 2 years. They have 56 people on their wait list.
Across both of our sexual assault services, we've got less than 4 counsellors across the 2 services, which, when you consider the amount of demand and the number of people waiting, really just, it doesn't add up.
The Western Australian government is now in the process of reforming its policies on sexual violence to address the crippling shortages.
I am absolutely very hopeful. And the hope and the goal is that as a result of these reforms is that we will see better outcomes for victim survivors where they have timely access to specialist services across the state, no matter where they live.
Hi, you've called Full Stop Australia. How can I help you today?
The National Sexual Assault Hotline operated by Full Stop is unable to respond to 1 out of 3 callers.
Oh, that doesn't sound very good at all.
We can't rest while we have areas across the country where people who are impacted by sexual violence cannot even access a single service. It is incredibly urgent.
The Federal Minister for Women's Safety, Anne Ruston, said in a statement that the government is in the process of establishing a Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Commission to deliver better results for victim survivors.
This is the psychological report that I had conducted earlier this year.
After being turned away 3 times, Karen Isles ended up getting counselling. But she says it was a combination of luck and persistence to access the support she so desperately needed. Her psychological report says the years of unaddressed trauma has had a significant impact on her ability to heal.
I was left to my own devices, and somehow I don't know how, somehow I pulled myself through it. Somehow. Good family.